If there was a soul drifting somewhere between survival and loss, would you recognize it? If that form made no sound, asked for nothing, just lay there, soaked, trembling, seemingly already let go, would your heart still carry enough sound to hear what all other senses had long ignored? The rain had just ended when Elias Monroe drove through the southern forest of Eastbridge. Water still trickled from the eroded hillsides, carrying the damp scent of rotting leaves, and something else, something that once lived. In the back seat, his 6-year-old daughter Lila pressed her face to the window, her eyes still as a lake after a storm. No seizures for 3 days now. But Elias knew. Silence was never a guarantee. He used to be a veterinarian before the accident took Claire, his wife, and left Lila with brain damage that could never fully heal. From then on, he stopped being a doctor. He became a father. And then Lila spoke. "Daddy, stop!" The tone in her voice made Elias hit the brakes, not because it was a command, but because something about it felt like a memory. Before he could ask, she opened the door and stepped out, making her way through the mud toward a fallen tree blocking the trail. Beneath the tree, something stirred. A scrap of wood adrift. A German shepherd, drenched, its hind leg twisted, chest rising with labored breaths. A deep, swollen mark circled its neck. Burns are still raw, spreading across its side. "He was left behind," Lila whispered, "like I was at the hospital. They didn't think he'd make it." Elias knelt, hands trembling as he reached for the mud-caked body. The dog didn't snap, didn't flinch. He simply stared at Lila, eyes holding something. Not quite pain. "Do you know what he's trying to say?" Elias asked softly. Lila nodded. "He's saying, 'Don't leave me behind again.'" The dog couldn't stand. His pulse was weak, temperature falling, blood crusted around burns that pulsed with heat. To Elias, once a trained vet, this was a critical case. Trauma, exhaustion, possibly organ failure. Part of him wanted to call for help, follow protocol. But before logic could speak, Lila had knelt beside him. "I won't leave him alone," she whispered, her trembling fingers brushing the soaked fur, as if holding on to something already slipping away. "Lila, you remember what I said, not to touch injured animals." Elias reached gently for her shoulder, but she shook her head. "Not an animal. A friend." Since the accident, Lila spoke little. But with animals, she had her own language, like a whisper not meant. To be answered, yet always heard. "You'll be okay," she murmured, her eyes locked on the dog's fractured gaze. "I was cold like that too, before the ambulance came." That made Elias pause. He remembered, too clearly. Claire was gone, and his daughter, only 3 at the time, had seized in his arms for 18 long minutes. Her tiny body had once been this cold, too. Lila placed her hand gently on the dog's head, then looked up at Elias. She didn't plead. There was only the quiet look of a child who had once wandered too far from life and refused to let anyone else do the same. "I'll call him Orion," she said, "because that's the star Mom taught me to draw." Elias didn't speak. He simply shrugged off his coat, laid it down as a cushion, and lifted the cold, broken creature in his arms, just like he once carried his daughter across the edge of loss. Up ahead, Lila waded through the mud, her raincoat flapping in the wind. But her eyes didn't look down. They looked forward, as if leading someone back into existence. The wooden cabin on the slope of Sycamore Ridge still smelled like rain. Elias laid the dog on an old cushion in his former office, a space where he once saved dozens of animals, but had locked away since Claire's passing. He didn't plan on being a doctor again. Yet his hands remembered how to prepare gauze, antibiotics, IVs, instincts that never truly fade. Orion lay still. No growl, no bark, just rapid, shallow breaths. Though feverish, leg shattered, skin scorched, his eyes still held on to something. Lila sat a meter away. She didn't touch him, didn't speak, just stayed there, like a breath waiting beside a life on the verge. "He may not make it through the night," Elias said, not as a warning, but as truth. "Deep trauma, blood loss, high fever." Lila didn't reply. She quietly reached into her pocket and pulled out a small stone, painted long ago with a heart, now faded. She placed it by Orion's paw. "He needs to know. Someone once chose him." Around 2 a.m., Orion shifted slightly. Then, to their surprise, let out a sound. Not a bark, but a breath with intent. He opened his eyes, not toward Elias, but toward Lila. She stepped forward without hesitation, laid her hand upon his head, and in that moment Elias saw something he hadn't dared hope for. Light. Flickering, fragile, but returning to his daughter's eyes. Lila whispered something, and for the first time in nearly 2 years, Elias saw his child smile. A girl once lost from the world, a dog once left behind, and between them, something that needed no words. The next morning, sunlight as thin as parchment filtered through the wooden frame, settling softly over the mattress where Orion lay. Lila sat on a folding chair beside him, legs dangling, one hand holding a tiny spoon, the other resting gently atop the gauze-wrapped form. Orion didn't eat much, but he kept his eyes open. Every time Lila spoke, the dog blinked, a silent signal between two minds that needed no language to understand one another. Elias stood at the kitchen, holding a coffee cup gone cold, unable to look away from the corner of the room. He'd seen veterans by the bedsides of wounded dogs. He'd seen children weep over missing cats. But the bond between Lila and Orion was unlike anything he'd ever known. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't dramatic. It felt destined. "I have a name for him," Lila said suddenly, without turning. Elias raised a brow. "Oh? What is it?" "Orion," she replied, her voice steady, as if she were stating a truth, not making a choice. He walked over and sat beside her. "Why Orion?" She didn't answer right away. She looked down at the dog's steady breathing, then whispered, "Because Orion is the star Mom showed me, when I was too young to remember anything else." Elias froze. He remembered that night, a winter evening when Lila was 2. Claire had carried her outside after a small seizure. The sky was cold and full of stars. Claire had pointed to a cluster that never seemed to vanish from the January sky. "Orion is the night's guardian," she'd said. "He doesn't go to sleep until you're safe." Lila couldn't possibly remember those words. Yet somehow, she had kept them. Elias gently brushed his daughter's hair aside. That simple act made her lean against his shoulder, a moment so tender no one dared breathe. The German shepherd snorted lightly and shifted, as if acknowledging the name, then settled again, as if content. "Orion," Elias echoed. "A name to guard the night." "Not every night," Lila whispered. "Just the ones when you're not sure if you'll wake up in the morning." That line, as quiet as breath, made Elias let go of the coffee cup and wrap his arm around her, pulling her close. He once lost someone he couldn't save. But maybe this time, he was just in time. Even if it was just one name. Even if it was just one breath that didn't give up. It took Orion 3 days to lift his head, 6 days to take a few wobbly steps down the short hallway between the office and the kitchen, and nearly 2 weeks to bark for the first time. Not from pain, not from hunger, but when Elias dropped, a stainless steel spoon onto the stone floor. That bark made Lila burst into laughter, a rare sound that made Elias set down his coffee without realizing. The dog's recovery was slow, but steady. like an old clock being rewound, not by machines, but by the warmth of a 6-year-old girl reading beside his cushion every morning. Orion didn't eat much, didn't sleep much, but whenever Lila sat down, he'd shift closer, resting his head gently in her tiny palm, breathing as though he'd just finished a long overnight watch. And then Elias began to notice. Something had changed. Lila still took her medication regularly, but there were no more nighttime seizures, no sudden blackouts during meals, no unexplained tumbles while stacking stones on the porch. He didn't dare say it aloud, afraid the spell might break if he named it. But the notes in his journal spoke for him. Day 4, no irregularities. Day 7, slept through the night. Day 10, eyes brighter. Lila still didn't talk much, but her face had softened, as if a noise once trapped in her head had finally faded, leaving just enough quiet to feel alive. And every time Elias wanted to whisper thanks to someone, he'd look over and find Orion sitting at the door, ears alert, eyes locked on Lila. No training, no commands, just a dog who'd once been left behind, now choosing to stay. At first, Elias thought it was a coincidence. Orion stood guard outside Lila's room one early morning, tense, ears up like he was protecting something. Minutes later, Lila collapsed. A seizure came on fast, but not severe. Orion didn't bark, didn't panic. He simply moved in, lay beside her, and rested his head on her thigh. Silent, present, close enough to catch her. The second time, Lila was coloring on the porch when Orion suddenly left his cushion, circled her 5 times, then sat heavily just behind, as if predicting where she'd fall. 30 seconds later, the convulsions began. And this time, Elias couldn't deny it. Orion had known. From then on, Elias started keeping records. Day 10, low howl 40 seconds before a mild seizure. Day 12, scratched Elias's door, eyes fixed on the hallway. Day 14, sat at the edge of the bed with no visible warning signs from Lila. No cues, no prior training. The dog simply knew. There were moments Elias felt like he wasn't the only one watching over Lila, that another presence, quieter and more attuned, was sharing the task. A creature that didn't need stethoscopes or ECGs, just one glance, one soundless shift, and it understood what was coming. And Elias, once a veterinarian, didn't know which column to write that under in a medical report. "Why do you sit next to Orion every time you feel breathless?" he asked one evening. Lila looked at him, her eyes glowing beneath the soft nightlight. "I don't feel it at first. He does. Every time I start to fade, he's already there. So I know I'm still here." Elias said nothing. He just sat on the floor beside her bed. On one side, a man who had lost his wife to a medical accident. On the other, a dog who'd been abandoned. And between them, a child learning to survive. Not through medicine, but through a being who knew exactly when to stay close. Elias returned to something he had long abandoned: textbooks, neurological data, studies on canine brainwave sensitivity. He read every night after Lila fell asleep, annotating margins with pencil beside formulas that once meant everything to him. The term canine seizure detection appeared again and again, but all studies led to the same conclusion: ongoing research, no definitive explanation. Some papers suggested that dogs could detect micro-scent changes as serotonin levels shifted before a seizure. Others speculated on bioelectromagnetic sensitivity, but all remained theoretical. No one could explain how some dogs sense seizures 60 to 90 seconds in advance, like Orion. He'd had no training, no instructor, no cues taught with bells or chemical samples. And yet, he knew when another soul was drifting from the earth. Elias pulled out his old infrared camera and mounted it in the living room corner. He recorded 72 hours of continuous footage. And then, one quiet afternoon, as Lila lay reading, he saw it. Orion stood up, turned his head, walked to her side before any symptom showed. He tapped her palm gently. She put the book down immediately, and 10 seconds later, the seizure hit. Elias froze the frame at that precise moment, Orion staring straight into Lila's eyes. No blink, no fear, just knowing. He leaned back in his chair, gaze fixed on the screen. Decades of academic learning had never taught him this. Maybe not everything needed to be proven. Maybe some things only existed when you were quiet enough to witness them. Elias didn't share it with many. He knew the look the medical world gave to things it couldn't explain. They'd nod politely, then underline anecdotal in the report. There was only one person he dared to call. Dr. Evelyn Zhao, pediatric neurologist, 32, once a student of Elias's during his teaching days at the State Veterinary College. She had sharp eyes behind round, glasses, and a habit of never interrupting, even when listening to things no one believed. They met at a cafe near the hospital. Evelyn was still the same, lab coat folded neatly over her chair, a black coffee she never drank past halfway. "I've heard," she said after he shared, "and I don't think you're imagining things." Elias looked up, not because of her answer, but because her voice held no judgment, no skepticism, just someone listening. "I know," he said slowly. "Every theory needs data. But this time, I just want to believe in what the numbers can't explain." Evelyn nodded. "There's a term in clinical studies," she said. "Sentinel intuition. A few beings, human or animal, can sense what machines cannot. The question isn't whether it's real, it's whether we have the courage to log it as data, even if we don't yet know how it works." She paused, then added, "I may not understand, Orion. But if you want to record it, I'll stand with you. You don't need to prove it to me first." Elias didn't respond, but for the first time in years, he left that cafe with something he thought he'd lost for good. Hope. Rain fell gently the night before Lila's 6th birthday. The porch roof clicked with soft, steady taps, like a clock with no hands. Inside the small beige bedroom, a moon-shaped nightlight cast a warm golden hue, painting the shadows of 2 forms against the wall. A child curled under a blanket, and a dog keeping watch along the edge of the bed. Orion was as he always was, eyes half open, ears tilted toward Lila, his body resting on its side, ready to spring up at any moment. Lila lay still for a long time. Then, softly, she spoke. "Orion." The dog didn't move. But Elias, sitting just outside in the hallway with a lukewarm cup of tea, heard something different in her voice. It wasn't like the other times. "Tomorrow I'll be 6, she said, as if sharing a secret. 6 already. People say when you're 6, you're supposed to be stronger. Do not cry when you fall." Orion breathed slowly. His gaze didn't shift from the ceiling, but Elias knew the dog was listening with some part of himself no one could see. "But what if I don't wake up tomorrow? Will you call me back?" The question floated in the rain-soaked silence. Not sad, not desperate, more like a quiet wondering, to see if the soul beside her would dare step into the deepest place in a child who knew, somewhere inside, that she could disappear at any moment. Orion shifted slightly. He didn't bark, didn't howl. He just nudged his nose against her hand. 3 times, slow and deliberate, then rested his head on the pillow beside her, like a bodyguard without a contract. Lila said nothing more. But Elias, still listening from just outside the door, wept. He had saved many lives. But this was the first time he witnessed a creature commit to saving a soul, not with words, but with presence. Just before Lila drifted to sleep, Orion stood. Not because of a noise, not because of a sudden movement. He simply did it, as if it were instinct, or perhaps a silent vow. He moved closer, lowered his head to her cheek, and licked her once, then again, and a third time, slower, gentler, as if sealing something, not to wake her, but to promise that this sleep would not become farewell. After that, Orion didn't return to the cushion in the corner of the room, as usual. He lay down right next to the bed, stretched alongside her body, shoulder brushing the mattress, tail curled toward his chest, like a quiet outline of protection. He didn't move for the rest of the night. Elias, sleepless in the next room, stepped in near 3 a.m. just to check that everything was all right. But when he saw the scene, his daughter sleeping peacefully, one hand resting loosely on Orion's thick fur, he couldn't take another step. There was something sacred in the way those two beings lay there. A child who had once brushed against death, and a dog who had once been left behind, now creating their own ritual. No one taught them. No book recorded it. But that night, it was born. And then, it repeated. The next evening, at the exact same time, Orion licked Lila's cheek 3 times again, then curled against her side. No one asked. No one prompted. By the third night, Lila turned her cheek to receive it. She didn't need an alarm clock, didn't need a bedtime story. She just needed Orion to do his part. "This is how we say goodnight," Lila whispered. And Elias understood. Though he couldn't be part of the ritual, he knew he was witnessing something more precious than any therapy he had ever studied. A bond, not born of the past, but in the future neither of them could afford to lose again. Silas Brennan didn't live in Eastbridge. He lived beyond it, literally. A wooden cabin sat isolated on the edge of the northern pine woods. No house number, no internet connection. And if you took the wrong trail to deliver a letter, you'd likely turn back halfway. Silas didn't need to be found. And he sent no one away. For the past 6 years, only 3 names knew he still existed. His lawyer, a former comrade from Afghanistan, and Claire. Brennan, his sister, who died too soon in an accident he learned about only after everything was over. Silas didn't attend the funeral, not because he didn't want to, but because he wasn't sure he was allowed. People here still remembered what happened back then. The day Silas Brennan, a former combat medic who once saved lives in the ravines of Kandahar, charged into the town hospital parking lot and broke the chief physician's ribs. No one mentioned the reason. They only remembered the sentence, 18 months in jail. His medical license was revoked. His reputation smeared as unstable. Few knew that he had witnessed a child being denied emergency care that day, simply because his mother had no insurance. The boy had collapsed from a high fever on the waiting room floor. And that same physician, who once declared every life is worth saving, turned away and signed the rejection slip. Silas didn't follow protocol. He followed instinct. Just like when he dove through gunfire to reach a wounded private, he had rushed in. This time to defend something he called righteousness without permission. After the trial, he vanished. And since then, only the wind through the forest remembered that Silas Brennan was still breathing. The old veterinary clinic in Eastbridge had long been converted into a makeshift rescue center. No signage, no white coats, just a few volunteers taking shifts to care for abandoned animals, and a hand-painted wooden sign swaying on the porch. "We don't heal. We stay." Silas never made it a habit to visit the place. But that day, a gray morning when he drove into town for gauze to treat a slow-healing burn on his wrist, he stopped the truck for reasons he couldn't name. Maybe it was a memory. Maybe the smell of iodine in the air. Or maybe it was the sight of a German shepherd lying silently beside the waiting bench, eyes fixed on a barely ajar wooden door. The dog didn't growl, didn't move, just watched, as if guarding something no one else could see. Silas sat a few steps away. He didn't intend to touch him. But then, the dog's gaze met his, and they stood still like that for nearly a minute. Silent. Director. No judgment. No fear. When a young volunteer came out, she spoke as if giving a nervous introduction. His name's Orion. A family took him in, but he's back today for a leg brace check. Is there a file? Silas asked, not sure why he was speaking. She nodded and handed him a simple chart. Intake date, notes about burns and fractures, and a single faded entry under object found on body. Metal tag. Number faded, format resembles military ID, removed to prevent infection, stored in archive. Silas froze. He had worked in K9 medical support. He knew that type of tag. It wasn't for civilian dogs, not available commercially, and the tag's code began with KX-17. That was the format used by a military working dog unit reported lost in 2015, the same unit he had once been assigned to assist before being pulled out mid-operation. He looked up again at Orion. It couldn't be. But maybe it could. Some scars don't show on skin, and some beings are born to serve, then cast aside when no budget remains to call their names. Orion kept looking at him. No bark, no stir, just waiting. That night, Silas pulled an old laptop from the wooden cabinet where he kept things he never meant to use again. The flashlight had flickered in the USB port, just like his thoughts, half believing, half hoping he was wrong. He logged into the Field Medical Division's archive, a long-forgotten clearance no one had bothered to revoke after his license was stripped. In the section titled Canine Support Units, Not Reintegrated, Silas pulled up the 2015 records, the year of a failed deployment along the northern Jordan border. The entire unit was restructured afterward, with no official debrief. There had been 5 dogs in that record. 3 were returned to the holding facility in Texas. 1 died during withdrawal. The last, VX-21, was marked missing. The only note below the name read, "Unlocated. No command response. Presumed KIA during operation. Tracking ceased due to lack of funds." VX-21 was a military code, and Orion was a name chosen by a child for a creature the world had erased with the words, "No longer of use." Silas printed the list, folded it, and slipped it into his coat pocket. His wrist still bore the old scald burn from a botched evac operation. But tonight, the real pain was elsewhere. Because if VX-21 and Orion were one and the same, this wasn't just about a lost dog. It was proof that some beings gave everything in service, only to be left out of the final report. Forgotten. Silas stood before the mirror, staring at a face aged too quickly by choices that couldn't be undone. And for the first time in years, he felt he had to return. Not to clear his name, but to return a name to a night sentinel who had never left his post, even when no one else from the unit came back. That afternoon began like so many others, damp and dim, with the smell of decaying leaves riding the breeze and distant thunder rumbling near the horizon. Elias had always felt uneasy on stormy days, not just because the old roof groaned with every gust of wind, but because of Lila, who, whenever a storm approached, grew quieter than usual. She wasn't afraid of lightning, but something in those heavy clouds seemed to make her eyes more distant, as if her body was hearing a signal the adults couldn't detect. At 3:12 p.m., Lila was drawing by the window. Orion curled at her feet, his head resting on her leg like always. At 3:17, Elias was making tea, and at 3:18... Orion leapt up, No bark, no howl, just sprang to his feet. He scratched lightly at the inside of Lila's arm, then let out a low, urgent whine, a sound that wasn't to be ignored. Elias turned, stepping quickly towards the window, but everything had already moved too fast. Lila collapsed. Her pencil hit the floor, and her small body began to seize, violently, unpredictably, more intensely than ever before. Orion immediately circled behind her, wedging his body to support her head so it wouldn't hit the wooden floor. He didn't move, didn't flinch. He just held his ground like a living shield. "Lila!" Elias rushed over, mind blank, hands fumbling through the nearest drawer for the emergency kit. But something was different this time. Lila didn't respond. No groan, no trembling at the end of the seizure like before. Only silence. Orion remained right there, eyes wide, ears pinned back, every muscle taut as if trying to hear a signal from someplace very far away. But nothing came. No sound, no answer. Just a storm still rolling in. This time not outside, but right in the center of a home that had never feared the rain. Paramedics arrived in just 8 minutes. But 8 minutes, in a house full of memories and a father kneeling on the wooden floor holding his daughter, was too long. Orion never left Lila's side. When the medics brought the stretcher in, he growled softly, not out of aggression, but as if to say, "If you take her, you'd better bring her back." Elias held Orion's collar, whispering something close to prayer. "They're only taking her to save her, son." At the county hospital, white hallways and footsteps became the soundtrack to a kind of waiting no one ever wants to learn. Lila was rushed into emergency care. EEG nodes attached, no light reflex in her eyes, no more seizures. But all readings were empty, like a song that had gone silent at its crescendo. Elias stood motionless outside the observation window, fists clenched inside the pockets of his rain-soaked coat. Orion sat pressed against his. Feet. He didn't bark, didn't cry, but his eyes never left the blurred silhouette of Lila through the glass. A tall physician in a clean white coat stepped out. "Mr. Monroe, I'm the attending doctor tonight. I'm afraid there's no detectable brain activity. The EEG is completely flat." Elias didn't understand immediately, or perhaps he didn't want to. We followed the full emergency protocol. Her heart responded briefly to the injection, but there's been no neural response. Silence. The printout from the EEG machine still lay there, coiled like a wordless indictment. Hours later, a nurse led Elias into a private room and placed a folder in front of him. A document confirming cessation of vital functions. A form offering to forward the case to forensic examination, should the family request it. And lastly, a temporary death certificate. They handed him a pen. He held it, though he couldn't remember if his hands were shaking. The name printed in block letters. Lila Claire Monroe. Elias didn't sign. He just stared at those 3 words. The name he and Claire had chosen after learning their daughter would arrive in December, the season of the most fragile lights. And now, that name lay atop a paper confirming that light had gone out. The night inside the hospital stretched longer than any other Elias had ever known. White corridors, fluorescent lights dimmer than their time. The breathing machine pulsed steadily, a biological habit sustained simply because no one yet had the strength to turn it off. Lila lay there, her eyelids still, a tiny arm wrapped in bandage from the emergency injection. Elias sat on a folding chair outside the recovery room, his head in his hands. Around his wrist, he still wore Lila's rubber hairband, the one she used to tie her hair and then wear like a little talisman. Orion didn't sit. He stood for hours at the door to the intensive care unit. At first, just watching. Then began to scratch gently. whimper quietly. And when the clock passed midnight, Orion started barking. Not loudly, not constantly, but just enough that every passerby turned, exchanging glances that asked, "There's a dog in here?" A nurse came over, gesturing for Elias to calm him down. Elias stroked Orion's head, but the dog wouldn't stop. Every 20 to 30 minutes, he'd rise again and bark once. Just once. As if answering a question no one else could hear. "He senses something," Elias whispered to the night nurse. "We understand you're grieving," she replied, gently but distantly. "But sometimes animals don't understand the truth." Elias didn't argue, because he knew the one who didn't understand the truth might be human. Orion didn't stop. From 1 a.m. to 4 a.m., he barked 4 times, each time after circling Elias once, lifting his head to stare through the observation window, then turning back and making that same sound Elias had heard every time Lila had a seizure. A warning. But this time, nothing happened. No tremors, no awakening, just a child lying still, and a dog who refused to accept that stillness as reality. Elias didn't sleep. He simply sat there, one hand resting on Orion's back, feeling each breath as if it were an act of defiance. No one expected the funeral to take place here, not in a church, not at the city cemetery, but in the garden behind the old wooden house at the end of Alder Creek Road, the place where Lila's mother once wrote children's books, and where Elias used to believe was the beginning of all gentle things. Claire loved this garden. Every spring, she'd lay a blanket in the middle of the wild grass, place infant Lila in a woven basket, and read aloud the words she'd written. She called it the first voice a child should hear, one from the heart. Now, in that very place, a white casket rested between 2 ash trees just beginning to bud. Elias hadn't chosen the color. Lila had once said that if she ever died, she wanted everything to be simple. But when asked, Elias had gone quiet. And the funeral director, an old acquaintance from town, had picked white. The color of soft endings, free of blame. Beside the casket stood a wooden table draped in linen, holding a photo of Lila laughing, taken by Elias last fall when Orion had just learned to walk on 3 legs, and Lila jokes, "We should start a circus." In one corner sat a jar of wildflowers gathered from the forest out back, and a painted stone with a heart drawn in acrylic. Elias stood motionless. He didn't cry, didn't tremble, but couldn't feel where his hands ended and the earth began, where wind touched skin or voices met ears. The rows of folding chairs lining the path were nearly full. More people came than he'd expected. Some were strangers. Some had shaken his hand after Claire's death, and then disappeared forever. But they came. And Elias, though no longer believing in ritual, nodded, quietly grateful. Orion wasn't there, not because he wasn't allowed, but because Elias wasn't sure he could bear it. The dog had stayed in the hospital room when the funeral car pulled away. He didn't eat, didn't sleep, just lay by the bed, his head resting on the empty fold of the blanket where Lila once slept. Every time Elias came near, Orion opened his eyes briefly, then turned away. Elias understood. The dog hadn't said goodbye yet, but humans can't wait forever for a hope that won't return. A wind chime jingled faintly on the porch. A song Claire had saved on her wedding day began playing from a small speaker brought by an old friend. The melody wasn't sad, but today every sound felt like something replayed from a life whose chords had been pulled. Everyone sat. The local pastor stepped forward, holding an old Bible in his hands. Elias didn't hear what he said, because he was staring down at his shoes, muddy, grass-stained, soaked with something that could have been morning rain, or the last tears he'd allowed himself to shed in front of others. No one spoke as the pastor finished his reading. He closed the Bible, bowed his head, and stepped away, as though afraid the sound of his footsteps might disturb something fragile still hanging in the air. Pain, memory, or a farewell no one had fully voiced. Elias remained standing, unmoving, like a statue forgotten in a garden where sunlight filtered through leaves and shadows stretched long over the grass. The wind touched his lapels, the corners of his eyes, and the hollow in his palm where a little hand once rested every time they walked the garden path together. The chairs along the path were full. Lila's preschool teacher sat quietly, hands folded in her lap as if holding a lesson plan no school had ever taught. An elderly neighbor clutched a frayed teddy bear, the one Lila had once tossed over the fence, saying, "He's sleepy and doesn't have a pillow." A boy from the neighborhood, who used to dig in the dirt with her, held a pebble painted with a watercolor angel. He said he would send her up high so she could see the whole town from above. None of them spoke loudly. None cried out. But in the silence, Elias felt the entire town holding its breath, so the little girl wouldn't be afraid on her way out. Someone placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. He didn't turn. Not because he didn't want to know who it was, but because if he did, one glance might shatter what little remained standing inside. An old friend placed a small notebook beside Lila's photo. Inside were scribbled notes from her classmates, some misspelled words, some just drew flowers, but each started the same. "You're still our friend." Elias bowed his head slightly, but his eyes stayed dry. There is a kind of pain that needs no tears. It just sits there, like an uninvited guest no one dares to send away. The sky was pale gray. The wind carried the scent of ash blossoms and damp soil. Everything felt adjusted to a softer volume, just enough so no memory would fall through the cracks of ordinary sound. A small blue ribbon, the color Lila once said looked like cold wind, had been tied to the corner of the casket. Elias didn't know who tied it, but it fluttered gently, like a tiny flag made for a very small warrior. No eulogy was read. Elias had written nothing. He tried once. But sitting before the blank page, he realized there were no words for a being who had existed so completely, and then simply did not. So he just stood there, silent. Because somewhere deep within, he knew, if there's any place on earth where language is no longer needed, it is here. Now, where everyone had already said enough, just by showing up. The County K-9 facility was tucked behind the police precinct, at the end of the road that led up into the hills. Steel double doors, secure locks, fingerprint scanners, surveillance cameras, and a clearly posted sign. No entry after 10 p.m., no animal contact without authorization. But no one had put up a sign that dogs could read. Orion was held there, by protocol, under supervision of companion animal after caregiver loss. That was how they phrased it, as if the bond between him and Lila had been one of ownership. At first, the dog didn't react. He lay still in the kennel nearest the window, his gaze fixed on the courtyard beyond, where yellow light caught streaks of rain. He didn't howl, didn't bark, didn't eat. The night shift staff thought it was normal. A grieving dog lost his kid. But around midnight, a sharp metallic screech tore through the quiet. The first door, a thick wooden one separating the kennels from the corridor, swung open with its hinges bent clean out of place. Orion had slammed into it with full force, again and again, without pause. Next came the steel door, locked by code. The camera footage showed it. Orion didn't run wild, didn't panic. He moved down the hallway as if he knew every step, every turn. When he reached the main entrance, he stopped, scratched 3 times, let out a deep, low cry. Not a plea. A signal. No one answered. So he jumped. Straight at the lock, then again, and again. By the fourth strike, the door dented. The hinge gave way, and the door burst open as though what had held it back wasn't steel at all, but the last restraint of a soul running out of patience. The K9 unit went on alert immediately, but by the time they arrived, Orion was gone. All that remained was a smear of blood on the doorframe, a leash snapped clean where the tension had peaked, and a still broken night, now stirred, because one guardian had returned to his post, regardless of any human rule. Officer Nate Ellison was on duty that night. He wasn't a stranger to Orion. One of the few officers who had worked in the K9 Assisted Pediatric Therapy program, Nate knew Lila, and the way that dog had never once taken his eyes off her. So when the alarm rang out, he was the first to reach the kennels. And when he saw Orion charging toward the exit, Nate stepped in. Not with force, just one firm command. Stay. But Orion didn't stop. He didn't bite, didn't resist. He simply crashed past, shoulder slamming Nate hard enough to send him into the wall. A dry crack snapped through Nate's left wrist. Damn it, he muttered, gripping the swelling joint. But instead of radioing for backup, he watched Orion disappear into the dark, running with the pace of something that didn't know exhaustion. And at that moment, Nate didn't see a dog on the run. He saw a soldier, returning to post. A being who knew exactly where he was needed, and couldn't allow the one he protected to be lowered into the earth without standing guard one last time. Nate pulled out his keys. No report, no protocol, just a scribbled note taped to the radio console. Do not pursue. I believe he still has work to do. Then he started the patrol car, turned off the GPS, and drove in the only direction Orion might have taken. Toward the hill behind the Monroe house, where the ash garden waited. And a white casket lay beneath the overcast sky, waiting for the sun to pass its highest point. The screech of tires on gravel made every head turn. A patrol car skidded to a halt at the edge of the garden. The door swung open. No explanation, no warning. And then, before anyone could ask, Orion leapt out. No leash, no handler, no muzzle. Just a body of fur, charging through the crowd with a stride no one dared to stop. Elias shot to his feet, too late to speak, too stunned to move. And then, the unthinkable happened. Orion jumped straight into the white casket. Everything froze, as if time itself had been gripped by the throat. No one spoke. No clicking cameras, no whispers, only wind and a dog standing still, all four legs trembling with strain and sheer effort to remain still. No barking, no howling, no scratching, no pushing, just guarding. Orion slowly lowered his body, folding his legs like it was a ritual. He lay down, head slightly, raised, eyes wide, fixed toward the line of trees where the sunlight was beginning to retreat. Not the gaze of a grieving animal, but the gaze of a sentinel, still on duty. Elias felt a jolt in his chest. The entire garden held its breath. A woman reached out to pull her son close, but stopped, her hand settling gently on the boy's shoulder instead. An elderly man removed his glasses, wiped them with the edge of his shirt, but didn't put them back on. Orion lay there as if someone had ordered, "Do not let this soul pass alone." He didn't ask. He didn't seek permission. He simply did what hearts too full for words always do for each other. Stayed. Until the end. And in that instant, before anyone could invent a polite reason to stop him, the funeral ceremony no longer belonged to the humans. Orion lay still, not moving, yet every part of his body is tight with purpose, his legs pressed against the casket, his head tilted slightly, ears upright, as if listening to something no one else could hear. No one understood. They only saw a dog on a cold white box and thought it was grief. loyalty taken to its last breath. Only one man, standing at the edge of the garden, suddenly froze. Silas Brennan. He had arrived late, meant only to observe from a distance, unnoticed. But the moment his eyes locked onto Orion, and that posture, everything in him shifted. Side-lying stance, neck straight, ears raised, body aligned with the point of contact. This wasn't mourning, it was a battlefield medical alert. Silas had taught K-9 emergency response. He had lived long enough among helicopters and hot blood to recognize it immediately. Orion wasn't guarding a corpse. He was trying to save someone still alive. "Don't touch him!" Silas shouted, voice booming through the garden, startling the guests. Heads turned. Elias looked up, as if truly seeing the man standing beneath the ash tree for the first time. Silas ran forward, pulling from his coat pocket a folded document, the VX-21 unit report. But he didn't need it. What he had to say fit into one single sentence. He's signaling. This is a residual internal response alert. It's not over. No one closes that casket. A ripple of silence spread across the lawn. Orion, as if given permission, began to whine. A deep, dragging sound from his throat, low and tense, almost identical to the warning noise he'd made before each of Lila's seizures. Elias stepped forward, slowly, shaking, and for the first time since Claire's death, he spoke 3 words he hadn't believed he could say again. "Stop. Right now." Silence. Not just within Elias, but in the entire garden, where dozens had come to say their final goodbye. A few turned, assuming Elias was speaking to Silas, the man who had just broken into the funeral with the force of someone who had forgotten how to be quiet. But no. Elias was staring straight at the casket, at Orion. And on the way, the dog refused to take his eyes off the white wood. Orion was whining now, constantly, not howling, not barking, but the low sound vibrated like every nerve in his body was trying to reach someone still standing on the thin line between staying and leaving. A woman whispered, "What is this?" A man shook his head. "It can't be." Then the murders began. He's lost control. This is the girl's funeral. You can't dishonor the dead like this. A dog doesn't get to decide death. Elias heard all of it, like a drizzle soaking through the fabric of mourning and into the skin. But he didn't move, because the only sound he truly heard was Orion's low whine and the feeling in his chest. The same one he'd felt 18 minutes the day he held Lila in his arms after Claire died. A feeling that said, "She hasn't gone yet." He stepped forward. The pastor hesitated, gripping his Bible, voice tightening. "Mr. Monroe, we're all grieving. Please don't let confusion become trauma for those still here." Elias nodded. "Yes, we are grieving. But if I stand here knowing there is a 1 in 1,000 chance my daughter is still alive and I stay silent, then I'm no longer her father. I'm just someone pretending to bury her on time." No one responded. Only Silas, still unmoving like a living monument in the garden, spoke slowly. "That dog is a soldier. He served in combat zones. And that position he's in, it's a frontline medical alert posture. It does not happen without a signal." The pastor lowered his head. He neither nodded nor objected. Elias turned to the funeral director, a man in his 50s, hand still resting on the casket latch, stunned. "You're a father," Elias said, not loud, but clear. "If your son were in there and the creature your son trusted most didn't accept what was happening, could you keep it shut?" No one answered. And in that exact moment, as Elias reached out and touched the bronze latch, the wood cold beneath his trembling fingers, Orion let out a cry, not in pain, not in anger, but I like permission, as if that sound meant, now, open it. Elias turned the latch, lifted the lid, and the whole garden stopped breathing. The casket creaked open slowly, the hinges groaning through an air thick as winter drapery. A few people flinched. Some turned away. One covered a child's eyes. Another grabbed a hand, not from cold, but from a fear colder than anything wind could carry. "What are you doing, Elias?" A gray-haired woman rose from the front row, voice trembling. "She's been pronounced dead. This is a funeral." "No one has the right to do this," an older man shouted. "This isn't a place for delusion. That's your daughter's body, Elias." "It's not a body," Elias replied, voice hoarse but steady. "It's my daughter." A ripple passed through the crowd. The young pastor rushed forward, an alarm on his face. "Mr. Monroe, please, be calm. We understand your grief, but this could harm people further." "Harm?" Elias turned, eyes red but dry. "Harm is signing a piece of paper because someone tells you your daughter's heart stopped, without hearing her voice first. You call that closure. I call it an unanswered question." Orion had now climbed onto the edge of the casket, sitting upright like a living statue. Ears sharp, eyes locked on the silent face of the girl, still unmoving, but not as cold as death usually is. "What are we doing?" a young woman whispered through tears. "We came to say goodbye. And now we're witnessing what?" Another voice, older, rough and sharp, cut through. Silas. He stepped forward, posture solid, gaze slicing through the confused and angry faces. "Has anyone here served on a battlefield?" he asked, voice low but heavy as stone. "Has anyone watched a K9 alert while machines said there was nothing left? I have, and the person that dog warned about lived." A man near the garden gate, wearing a veteran's jacket, nodded slowly. "I've seen it too," he said. "Once. We almost buried a brother. If it hadn't been for that dog." No one added to it. Orion sat perfectly still, body taut, eyes blazing into Lila, as if 1 second of looking away would mean losing something forever. A woman in black stepped forward, her eyes ringed and sunken, her voice cracked. "I lost a child once. You know how it feels to hope when it's false? It kills you twice, Elias." "I know," Elias whispered. "But if I bury my daughter while she's still alive, that's not pain. That's a sin I'll never wash away." That line tore through the air like a blade. A man began to cry. A woman held her husband's hand, silently shaking her head. "What if she still dies?" someone asked. "What if this only prolongs suffering?" Elias turned, his face no longer defiant, just weary, and still holding on. "Then, at least I'll have stayed by her until the end. Not the first one to give up." And then, as if in response, Orion let out a small whine. This time no one questioned it. Silas stepped closer. "He's hearing something we can't," he said softly. "And I believe we need to do the one thing no one has dared. Wait." A little girl, one of Lila's classmates, stepped forward with a broken-colored pencil in hand. Quietly, she placed it on the white cloth covering Lila's chest. Her small hand trembled, but her eyes didn't blink. "This was hers," she whispered. "I think—" She didn't finish her drawing. The silence was no longer hesitation. It had become something else, like the hush that falls when the noise of life fades just enough to let something fragile and real be heard. Elias looked down at his daughter's hand. Then a single finger moved. So slight, so slow, but it moved. Orion whined again, louder this time. A woman gasped, A man dropped into his chair, eyes wide, because the impossible had just happened when there were no words left to say. Silas stepped forward, pressed 2 fingers to Lila's wrist. He closed his eyes, counting. Not with just his training, but with his whole heart. When he opened them, he nodded once. Pulse is weak, but it's there. Elias dropped to his knees, grasped his daughter's hand. Lila, I'm here. No answer, but her small fingers squeezed back, not strong, but strong enough to shatter doubt, reason, and every definition of what it means to let go. A nurse nearby began to cry. The man who had shouted earlier covered his face with both hands. Elias didn't look at anyone. He only lowered his head to his daughter's hand and whispered through trembling breath, "You heard me. I know. You heard me." And to seal it all, Orion howled, one long rising call that filled the garden, echoing like it was summoning a soul back to where it belonged. No one said a word, because sometimes life doesn't need to be proven. It only needs to be waited for. Elias remained kneeling beside the casket, his hand wrapped tightly around a hand that was still warm, still soft, still responding. At that moment, time stopped, or if it moved at all, it was rewinding something that had already been signed. Silas was the first to rise. He pulled out his phone, calling the county emergency center. His voice had no more fury in it, only the calm cadence of a battlefield medic. Resuscitation in progress. Female, age 6, showing signs of life after being declared deceased. Location, 143 Alder Creek Road, requesting medevac, urgent. People began to move, not out of shock, but instinct, clearing a path, finding a landing spot, gathering supplies. No one gave orders. Everyone simply acted, not from duty, but from something deeper, a need to redeem. Orion had jumped inside the casket now. No one dared stop him. He curled at Lila's feet, head resting gently across her chest. Not weighing her down, not interfering. Just enough to connect. His eyes half closed, no longer sharp with tension. This was the gaze of someone who had completed his mission and was ready to guard it again. Elias saw it and said nothing. He didn't call him down. He didn't step forward. He only nodded, as if to say that if Lila had wandered far, Orion had been the only one brave enough to follow her to the edge and call her home. A gust whistled through the distant trees. The chop of helicopter blades grew louder overhead, folding into the wind and the unsteady breath of people who thought they had said goodbye. The helicopter descended into the clearing not 30 meters from the garden. Its rotors sent linens flying, scattered funeral cards, and toppled chairs, as if the old ceremony itself had bowed out, making way for the return of life. The doctor was the first to step out, a slim woman moving with purpose. She walked straight to Elias. "The patient?" she asked. Elias pointed to the casket. His voice cracked, but was firm. "My daughter." The doctor looked in, a pale girl but with a pulse, slight twitches in her fingertips, and beside her, a German shepherd lying still, his head resting gently across her ribs, eyes unblinking. The nurse stepped forward, but the doctor held up her hand. She knelt beside the dog. "We're taking her now. You can stay or come, but don't leave her." Orion blinked once, then rose. Slowly, carefully, like a ceremonial passing of the watch. Lila was lifted onto the soft stretcher, IV lines secured, heart monitor placed. The heart still beats, slow, but there. And no one dared call it an illusion now. Elias climbed aboard the helicopter. But before the doors closed, he looked back. Orion stood beneath the ash trees, watching. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He simply stood, still as the forest, witnessing the return of a soul to the world. The rotors lifted. The helicopter rose, carrying dust, petals, and the eyes of everyone in town. They didn't walk away, not to wait for more, but to remember that once, in this place, a dog called a child back from the edge of death. And right there, at the place where the casket had once closed, Orion walked in. No one stopped him. No one dared. He lay down. Among fading flowers, among pine-scented wood, among farewell notes, no one dared speak again. No one knew exactly why, but they watched as he closed his eyes. As if, now that the world had heard the signal, he was finally allowed to sleep. No one understood why. They only saw him close his eyes. As if, once the world had heard the signal, he was finally allowed to sleep. The medevac helicopter left Eastbridge's sky at 4:38 p.m., carrying a 6-year-old girl with fragile signs of life, and a father with no tears left. Inside the white cabin, medical equipment filled the silence with low warning tones. Each beep was a thread holding on. Each machine-aided breath, a quiet note begging her to stay. Elias sat beside the stretcher, unmoving. He only reached now and then to lightly touch Lila's knee, as if letting go for even a moment might allow her to fall back into a place where he had no authority to follow. The flight doctor, Dr. Mirren, a veteran of over 20 years in aerial emergency medicine, glanced at Elias a few times as though wanting to speak. But she stayed quiet. She had seen miracles before, but never one triggered by a dog's eyes. Over 2 hours later, Lila arrived at St. Harlow's Pediatric Neurology Intensive Care Unit. This was a place where most families wouldn't even dream of entering without special insurance or national referral programs. But this time, due to the exceptional circumstances, regional medical appeals, and the emergency protocol itself, the hospital granted an emergency override admission. She was placed in room 804, the critical neuromonitoring zone. 2 nurses reattached full arrays of brainwave sensors, blood flow monitors, oxygen levels, blood pressure, and neural reflex trackers. Elias was led to the hallway, a spotless white space. No blood smell, no harsh disinfectant. Only the sterile scent of glass and cold steel. He sat in a wall-mounted chair, eyes locked on the double-pane soundproof window. Lila lay inside, small and still beneath a halo of glowing instruments. Footsteps. Doctor. Ariane Shu, the lead neurologist, approached. An Asian woman in her early 40s, thin and reserved, with the dry edge of someone who moved daily along the border of life and death. She held the file. Her eyes were not cold, but unflinching. "Mr. Monroe," she began, taking the seat across from him, "we've reviewed all pre-hospital data. Lila's case is extremely complex. She was declared clinically dead based on flat EEG, no reflexes, and a complete neurological shutdown for over 20 minutes. The return of physical response is unusual." Elias said nothing. "The latest EEG shows extremely faint activity, but present. Some slow response to light. However, we cannot yet confirm the depth of conscious recovery." "Prognosis?" Elias asked, his voice emerging like a sound from deep bone. Dr. Shu hesitated, then delivered it in the way only those who've known pain could. "Severe. Potential for long-term vegetative state. Possibility of awakening with permanent damage, or possibly no further progress." "But," Elias looked through the glass, "it has begun." "Yes," she nodded, "and we will follow it to the end." Silence returned. Only the small overhead lamp in Lila's room remained on, a circular bulb casting soft yellow light, switched on at dusk by nurses to simulate natural sunset for patients in deep coma. From a distance, it didn't look like hospital equipment. It looked like a single candle, as if someone had lit it, so that if any soul were searching for its way back, it might find the light. Elias leaned his head against the wall, eyes closed, hand resting on his knee as if Orion still lay somewhere at his feet, guarding each breath. And deep down, he believed that light was still seen, whether from very far or very near, not warm enough yet to open her eyes, but enough not to leave. Still there, a single light in a white room, waiting. The next morning, the first clinical conference was held on the 6th floor, where neurologists, intensivists, and psychological care specialists gathered to review exceptional cases. Lila Monroe's name was at the top of the list. Red underline. Unexpected resuscitation. Positive weak EEG. Dr. Ariane Shu chaired the session. She sat at the center of the table, hands on the file printed in triplicate, eyes focused nowhere, but her presence froze the entire room. The first to speak was Dr. Quentin, a veteran in acute brain trauma. With all due respect to the preliminary neurological activity, I still believe this case should not proceed with full intervention. EEG is weak, light reflex sluggish, no voluntary movement, no pain response. I'm not advocating abandonment. I'm suggesting palliative focus. Palliative care, a young resident repeated, voice trembling, as in the end-of-line approach? As in not imposing unrealistic hope on a patient with no prospect of regaining full consciousness, Quentin replied. He didn't sound cruel, but the clinical chill in his tone thinned the air in the room. A hand rose. Dr. Linden, young, from neurocritical care. His face still bore the disbelief from witnessing Lila's arrival. But we're looking at a child whose heart had stopped and came back. EEG isn't flat. There are motor reflexes. She reacted to the sound. I can't call that hopeless. That's not hope, Quentin said. That's spontaneous peripheral signal drift, biologic fringe activity, and if we sustain it with machines, we're adding pain not to the patient, but to her family. Do you have a daughter, Doctor? Quentin? Linden asked. Quiet. Clear. The room froze. The real question, Dr. Shu intervened, is the boundary between persistence and cruelty. This isn't about left or right. It's about the ethics of continuing or stopping. An older doctor sighed. I once witnessed a child awaken after 10 days of diagnosed vegetative state. No one believed, but the parents said, as long as she breathes, we'll read to her each night. And on day 11, she moved her toe. Lila moved her hand, Linden said, and reacted to her father's voice. We can't build a protocol on miracles, Quentin said. Perhaps not, Shu murmured, but we also can't throw away a chance just because it doesn't fit the chart. Outside the meeting, Elias remained seated exactly where he'd been the night before. He didn't know what was being said inside. But instinct, the same instinct that had made him open a coffin, told him his daughter's life was once again being negotiated on paper. He stood, walked to the head nurse's station. I'd like permission to read to my daughter each night, he said calmly, like a whisper smoothed over a stone. The nurse blinked. We're not certain she can hear. That's fine, Elias said, as long as I'm allowed to speak. Later, in the white room, under the same round lamp still glowing since dusk, Elias opened the folded picture book he used to read before Lila's seizures. The story goes, a little fox got lost from its den, he whispered. It wandered through snow, through forest, through black night, and each time it stopped, it heard footsteps beside it, not wind nor wolves, but a dog walking with it. He paused. Lila didn't move, but the light still glowed. His voice still spoke, and miracles didn't always show themselves immediately. Sometimes they only needed to be repeated, steadily, like a promise, like a breath, waiting. Orion was brought to the Special Care Wing's entry on a soft lead leash after 3 days waiting quietly outside the hospital corridor. Elias walked beside him. Neither led the other. They simply moved together. Through the glass of room 804, Lila still lay, unmoving, surrounded by tubes, sensors, and flickering green monitors. The pale gold light still shone. Not warm, not cold, but the only thing in the room that didn't beep, didn't blink. The only thing that waited. The charge nurse, a woman in her 50s with thick glasses and a firm voice, leaned down to unclip the leash. He's allowed inside, but no climbing on the bed, no touching equipment, and 30 minutes max. Elias nodded, said nothing. Orion didn't wait. He stepped through the automatic door, moved straight to Lila's bedside, and sat. No barking, no tail wag, no licking. Just watched. Watched like he had been here before, in some other place like this, where small arms no longer held and voices stopped mid-sentence, where people usually arrived once but never returned. This time Elias didn't follow. He stood at the door, and others, nurses, interns, the shift doctor, stood too, like they were all witnessing a ritual no one had been taught. About 10 minutes passed. The monitors didn't show any notable change. Then, suddenly, Orion let out a short, low growl. Not loud, not urgent, but to Elias it sliced through his spine, because he had heard it once before, when Orion stood atop his daughter's casket. "What's happening?" Elias asked, not to anyone in particular. A nurse rushed to the monitor, checked stats. "Stable," she murmured. "Heart rate 83. BP 94/60. O2 at 97. Nothing unusual." But Orion didn't move. He stood close to the bed, neck slightly stretched toward the left, the side where the EEG sensor was placed, his tail still, eyes tense, mouth slightly parted, as if waiting for someone to reply. 3 minutes later, the ECG remained steady, but the EEG monitor began to flicker. No alarm, just brief losses of signal. Then recovery, then lose again. An unstable pattern, known from rare cases involving deep temporal microvascular spasms, is difficult to detect without constant second-by-second observation. This time, Dr. Linden was already in the hallway. He entered quickly after being told the alert came from a service dog. When he entered, Orion had not moved. His eyes locked on an invisible point between Lila's brows, where an old bruise had faded a week ago. "Log the timestamp," Linden ordered. "Cross-check with EEG drift. I want exact seconds on when the dog reacted." 17 seconds. That was the delay between Orion's alert and the first EEG spike. In neurocritical care, 17 seconds is an eternity. At 1:27 p.m., the attending physician added a special note to Lila's daily log, marked with a red asterisk. Orion entered a designated list of biological sentinel markers. Not a machine, not a human, but a living monitor. From that day on, Orion was issued an ID badge, ORK9 Special Watch, and he returned. No commands, no schedules. Every morning at 7, every afternoon at 2, every evening at 9, he walked into room 804. Same path, same stop, same posture, head facing the child who had not yet woken, eyes searching, as if trying to remember something only they had ever shared. No one knew what Orion could feel. But everyone saw this. Orion knew when Lila changed, and no machine could register that. One night, when the hospital dimmed the halls for quiet hours, Elias sat alone by the glass. Orion had been in the room for over 40 minutes, well past the allowed limit. No one said anything, because at minute 38 he raised his head and growled again, but this time it was softer, like breath. And then Lila's finger twitched, lightly. Once. Not enough to call it awakening, but enough for the monitor to record non-reflexive motor movement. Enough for Elias, after all the waiting, to whisper, barely audible, "You heard me, didn't you?" Orion didn't reply. He didn't need to, because the answer was in the light, in the waveform, in the soul slowly returning. Quiet, slow, and met by eyes that never left their post. A night watchman? No white coat? Only a promise. That this girl would never be left behind. Not again. "Orion." The voice was raspy, trembling, thin as a thread just pulled through the eye of a needle, yet strong enough to pierce through the entire silence of the white room. Elias choked on his breath. He didn't know when the tears had started. He only knew that the hand gripping the edge of the bed had gone completely numb. On the EEG screen, a new wave rose, uneven, faint, but undeniably intentional. This was no longer a biological reflex, it was a signal. Orion, still lying still, moved only his ears. Then, slowly, he stood. Each step is deliberate, as if part of a ritual. No jumping, no barking, no wagging. He simply stepped closer, lowered his head, and gently placed his muzzle on the back of Lila's hand. And Lila, with a movement so slow it defied belief, shifted her finger, brushing lightly against the warm fur. A touch, unsteady, weak, but real. "Oh my God," the head nurse whispered. She stood frozen behind the glass, the patient chart still untouched in her hands. Elias turned, barely able to speak. "Get Dr. Shu and Linden, right now." Within 2 minutes, all three arrived, 2 doctors and a senior neurotechnician. No one asked questions. No one demanded explanations. Every eye fixed on the 6-year-old girl who, just a week ago, had been declared dead. "Lila," Dr. Linden said gently, leaning in with a pen light. "Can you hear me?" She blinked once, this time clearly. A reaction. Toward the light. No seizure. Dr. Chu gave the slightest nod, her gaze never leaving the child. "She's passed out of a deep coma. The chance of regaining active consciousness is very high." Elias let out a noise, something between a gasp and a laugh. "Hi? You mean she'll wake up? We need to monitor, but from now on, we no longer say if," she said. "We say when." Lila blinked again. Orion had not moved. He stood by her side, eyes locked on her face as if cataloging every sign, every flicker, every thread of memory being rewoven. "Orion," Lila said again. This time, clearer. Still only a whisper, but real. "You know who he is?" Elias asked, trying to steady his voice. She turned to him, looked for a long moment, then nodded softly. "When I was sleeping, I heard him. He didn't make a sound, but I knew he was there." Orion lay down at last, slowly, as if what he needed was now complete. Not with joy, not with relief, but something deeper, the quiet confirmation of a vow kept, a promise fulfilled, even if no one had ever heard it spoken. Outside, snow still fell. White light glimmered across the frosted glass, settling on the sill like the dust of time. Inside, the machines still hummed, but the rhythm had changed. A pulse. Steady. alive. Elias sat beside the bed, took his daughter's hand in his. The other hand rested gently on Orion's back. "Thank you," he whispered. "Not for saving Lila, but for not letting any of us, even me, believe she was already gone." Orion gave no reply. He didn't need to, because today, beneath the season's first snowfall and the faint warmth of the white room, a heart had opened its eyes. And for the first time, after breathing only through machines and surviving only on the hopes of others, Lila spoke a name. Not to call for help, not to resist, but to return, fully, once more, with Orion, and with her own heart. News that Lila Monroe had opened her eyes spread faster than any official medical bulletin ever released across the Northeast. But no one spoke of it as a recovery case. They called it a testimony of life, of patience, of something all the machines, from electrodes to charts, had once overlooked. Instinct. 3 days later, a line of people formed outside St. Harlow Hospital. No one asked to visit. They came to leave notes, flowers, or simply a small piece of paper with a childlike scrawl. "You're the reason I didn't give up," or "Thank you for coming back." Lila was still weak. Doctors only allowed a few minutes of conversation each day. But she smiled, a faint smile, her cheeks still pale from lack of blood, but no longer empty of light. And every time she smiled, she looked toward Orion first, as if this joy was a gift she had to share, with the one who never left her side in the long sleep. At the same time, hundreds of kilometers away, a federal ethics panel was convened. The emergency session didn't name the patient. It listed only the case code, EEEG-null, false death declaration. Emergency overturn. At the center of the review stood Dr. Lowell, head of emergency response at Riverfield Hospital, the one who had signed Lila's death certificate without a second clinical confirmation. "I followed protocol," he said. His voice wasn't angry. I was confused. "I followed every step. No vital signs. Flat EEG. No reflexes. That fits the academic definition of death." One council member, eyes fixed on the provisional analysis, asked, "Did you take into account the behavior of the dog at the time?" Dr. Lowell hesitated. "I'll ask again. At that time, did the dog display any signs of alertness?" "Yes," he admitted with a slow nod. "And you dismissed it as emotional behavior with no medical value?" "Yes, there is no credible literature that defines a dog as a biological indicator." The answer was not technically wrong, but it left the room in a different kind of silence. Not the kind born from respect, but from the recognition that some things humans overlook not because they don't see them, but because they lack the humility to believe. An internal investigation expanded, not just into Dr. Lowell's judgment, but into the entire regional presumed death procedure used in emergency response units. At the same time, a petition of nearly 40,000 signatures surfaced across medical networks, calling for a redefinition of non-instrumental resuscitation and an expansion of early detection criteria to include medically supported service animals. Back in East Bridge, the town once thought to be remembered only for a tragic funeral, something shifted, not through banners, not through speeches, but in small, steady acts, the way snow falls on a quiet night. A cafe framed a photo of Orion at the entrance, with a sign beneath it. Night Watch doesn't need a name. The local bookstore reprinted Lila's favorite picture book with a new dedication, for those who know how to wait. Her old preschool, where children once wrote goodbye letters, rehung the colorful paper flags Lila had strung up on her last day before the greatest seizure of her life. As for Elias, he didn't speak much. He didn't need to, because now, every time he stepped out of the hospital, he met the eyes of people who had once turned away, who once shook their heads, who told him not to cling to miracles. Now they didn't apologize. They didn't have to. They simply placed a hand over their heart and bowed their heads. A silent confession that sometimes miracles don't come to fix what's wrong. They come to remind us that one unwavering heart can change an entire system. 6 weeks after Lila opened her eyes, a special document arrived for Elias Monroe. It was not from the hospital, nor from the mayor's office. It came from the federal court of the region. The message was only 3 pages long, but attached was a re-examination file nearly 300 pages thick, marked with red ink. Urgent Special Review. At the bottom of the first page, one line was printed in bold. Based on new data concerning the incident at Riverfield Hospital and the testimony involving extraordinary medical recovery, we declare Silas Brennan is fully exonerated. His record is cleared. His honor was restored. He is no longer under supervision. Alongside it was an invitation. We respectfully invite Mr. Brennan to assume the role of Director, Rescue Dog Training Program, National Companion Recovery Network, Pilot Location, Eastbridge. Elias read that line over and over again. Each time, he glanced toward the rehab room where Lila was working through physical therapy with Orion. The dog rested his chin on her foot, eyes half closed, as if he had always belonged there. Elias walked to the small cabin on the edge of the forest, where Silas had lived in solitude for years. The old man was still sitting on the wooden step, fixing an old harness. When Elias held out the envelope, Silas didn't take it right away. "What is it?" he asked without looking up. "It's what you should have received years ago," Elias replied, his voice stripped of the calm he usually wore. Silas opened the letter, read it once, folded it back, said nothing. "They want you to lead a national program," Elias continued, "to retrain the forgotten dogs, so they can become the ones who call the souls home." Silas let out a small laugh, a sound that hadn't been heard in many seasons. "I've seen too many places where dogs are forced to serve humans," he said. "Never have I seen one where someone asked the opposite. What if these creatures carry a memory they were never allowed to tell?" "Then it's time to listen," Elias said, "not with microphones, but with eyes." 3 months later, the first center of the Backline Companion Recovery Program opened just outside Eastbridge. There were no banners, no pictures of founders, only a hand-carved wooden sign. "Here, the ones who were left behind will learn how to stay." Silas was the only one authorized for direct training and coordination, but he didn't work alone. The first partner he recruited was a man who had lost his wife, almost lost his child, and once knelt beside a coffin he thought would never open again. And under the wooden desk of the old office, between stacks of scattered files and a threadbare rug, lay Orion. Same eyes, not dulled, not older, no medals, no applause. Because for him, none of that had ever been a reward. They were a duty. The duty of a night watchman who had stood guard over a tiny heart until it found the road back. On the first snowfall of the next year, Elias brought Lila back to the backyard, where she had once watched woodpeckers and learned to draw constellations her mother taught her. Her hair had grown back, soft and thin as sunlight. She could not walk steadily yet, but she managed a few steps with crutches. And most important of all, she smiled. The snow blanketed the yard, ankle deep. Orion wandered at a distance, leaving tracks scattered like wandering thoughts. But then, just as Elias set up his camera to capture Lila's first winter alive again, the dog stopped. He didn't run. He didn't loop. He circled Lila slowly, once, then again, and stopped behind her, When Elias pressed the shutter, he thought it was just a photo of a little girl in the snow. But when he checked the screen, he froze. Orion's tracks were not random. They formed an arc, encircling Lila in the shape of an embrace. From the camera's angle, it appeared exactly as a heart. A heart of snow. No one asked for it. No one planned it. But it was there. The result of presence. Of someone who once stood guard over dreams, once called a soul back home. And now only needed to be close, to surround. 3 months later, that image became the official symbol of the Lila's Watch Foundation, an organization founded not to save sick children, but to protect one final moment. The moment when people usually say, "There's no hope," but something unseen has not yet let go. The Foundation's first motto wasn't on its website. It was carved beneath the image itself. Do not turn off the light if the light has not left. Lila was a co-founder, though only 7 years old. Orion was the living emblem. Elias became executive director. And Silas, once convicted for striking a doctor who refused care, designed the entire intuitive response training model for support dogs. In its first year, Lila's Watch trained 11 child dog pairs. 4 of them demonstrated early detection of seizures or blood pressure shifts before medical equipment responded. 2 were tested in coma care rooms, where patients' brain activity increased in the presence of sustained animal contact. But for Elias, those achievements were not what mattered most. What mattered were the letters, from families who had once lost children, who had once been told to sign quickly, to ease the burden, who had once stopped asking for fear of being seen as delusional. Letters, handwritten and raw, arrived from all over. "My son didn't survive, but he opened his eyes once when the dog entered the room." "My granddaughter was unresponsive until she heard the soft tapping of claws from a Samoyed across the tile floor." "We couldn't keep her, but we kept the final image. She knew who was there, and she wasn't afraid." In a rare interview, when asked what had driven him to build the foundation, Elias answered simply, "Because I nearly buried a child who was still alive, and a dog, who could not speak, screamed at me." At the 1-year celebration of the foundation, Lila stood on a small stage with Orion beside her. She didn't say much. She simply raised a picture she had drawn herself. A girl in the snow, eyes closed. Beside her, a brown wax crayon dog wrapped around her in the shape of a heart. At the top of the page, she had written in blue ink, "I'm not afraid anymore, because I know someone is waiting for me to wake up." The hall fell silent. And in the farthest row, where no spotlight reached, Silas nodded quietly. Orion rested his head on Lila's foot. And Elias, for the first time since the day Claire died, felt something strange. Small, fragile, but certain. His heart was no longer missing a piece. Some stories do not need to be spoken loudly. They only need to be told through a single gaze, like the way Orion looked at Lila throughout their journey between life and death. And there are souls that do not carry words, but whose every action becomes a message of loyalty, of connection, and of healing. The German Shepherd, a breed often known for bravery, intelligence, and devotion, goes far beyond the image of a protector. In this story, Orion was not just a dog. He was the gatekeeper between life and death, the bridge between despair and a miracle. As Anatole France once wrote, "Until one has loved an animal, a part of one's soul remains unawakened." The story of Lila and Orion is a reminder that some beings cannot speak with words, but love with their whole hearts. And sometimes, those hearts are the only force strong enough to hold someone in this world when everything else has let go. Tuesday morning. The city of Atlanta had just awakened after a night of rain, and the sky beyond the airport's glass panels shimmered with the glaze of early winter sunlight. A light breeze brushed through the rows of flags outside the international terminal, carrying with it the scent of freshly brewed coffee and the rhythmic sound of rolling suitcases gliding over the polished vinyl floor. Terminal 4, like every weekday morning, was overflowing with people. Families overloaded with bags, children screaming for candy, business travelers passing like shadows with wireless earbuds, airport staff tense between delayed flight announcements and streams of passengers trailing behind one another like ants. Everything felt as familiar as it was tedious, until Sable barked. Sable wasn't the kind of dog who made a first impression. His coat lacked the glossy sheen of magazine ads. His ears were always upright, but his gaze rarely moved quickly, unless there was a reason. Sable never barked without cause. Among the airport K9 team, he was known as the Silent Shadow, an odd nickname for a creature capable of detecting dried blood from 3 days ago, or analyzing human behavior simply by standing still. For more than 6 years, Sable had worked alongside Officer Jude Reyes through over 30 operations. From the southern border to international warehouses, from VIP flights to late-night emergency alerts, Sable had always been right. No theatrics, no noise. When other dogs barked on reflex, Sable would merely tilt his head and observe. And only when something truly deviated from his acceptable baseline, the bark would come. Slow, deep, and loaded with warning. Jude once said, "He doesn't say maybe. He says right now, or he says nothing." And that morning, in the heart of Terminal 4, when the first bark broke an 8-month silence, everyone who had ever worked with Sable stopped in their tracks. No one needed to be told, but in their gut, they all knew. Something was wrong. It wasn't the kind of bark that came from a forgotten bag, not the alert reflex to someone approaching the security line. It was sharp, direct, cutting into the spine like a sudden fire alarm. It rang out, clear and unmistakable, a sound rarely heard, especially not from the dog known as the quietest of them all. Even the seasoned staff jolted. A mother tightened her grip on her child. 3 foreign passengers froze mid-step, and in that moment, a stretch of Terminal 4 fell into a chilling, breath-held silence. Jude spun around. The leash in his hand pulled taut as Sable lunged a step forward, body extended as if trying to break through the limits of the rope. But the dog didn't leap into the crowd. He wasn't barking at thin air. Jude had seen combat. He knew what physical instinct felt like, when the body moves before the brain catches up. And Sable, more than anyone, had become that second nature beside him. They had worked together for nearly 6 years, from baggage inspections to late-night trackings in cargo zones. This dog had once saved a unit from an explosion with just a head tilt. And in over 30 missions, Sable had never given a false alert. "What is it, buddy?" Jude asked softly, his voice low like speaking to a person. He shortened the leash, eyes following the direction of Sable's stare. A well-dressed man in a sleek gray suit, hair neatly combed, clean-shaven, with a silver watch catching the terminal lights. On his left hand, he was holding a child around 5 years old, small enough to disappear beneath the hem of the blazer, head down, clutching a frayed teddy bear. They didn't look hurried. Their luggage was tidy, their pace unbothered. Everything was in place. Too in place. But Sable barked, as if the world were about to explode. Once, then twice, then a third time. Each bark short, low, but dense enough to thicken the air like every other sound had been silenced. The man paused, turned toward Jude, a polite crease forming between his brows in a well-rehearsed smile of surprise. But the boy didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't look. Just stood there, as if the barking hadn't reached him at all. Sable barked again, shorter, enough for a nearby officer to place a hand on their radio. Jude stepped forward 2 paces, raising one hand gently, signaling calm. He nodded at the security station behind him, then walked directly toward the man now facing him with a puzzled expression. "Excuse me, sir. I'm Officer Jude Reyes, Airport K9 unit. Would you mind stopping for a moment?" The man smiled. A perfect smile. Not too friendly, not too stiff. His American English carried a European lilt. Light, pleasant. "Is something wrong, officer?" he asked. "I'm Thomas Whitmore, U.S. citizen. This is my son, Micah. We're connecting to Brussels." Jude nodded, eyes locked on the boy, who still didn't move at the mention of his name. The teddy bear remained limp in his arms, its head tilted, eyes open, staring at no one. Thomas pulled out a plastic-sleeved file. Passports, birth certificate, a court-issued custody order from the state of Texas. Everything in pristine order. A dossier of legitimacy. Jude glanced over the documents. Nothing seemed off. Even the boy's passport photo matched. But something inside Jude didn't match. Sable still hadn't moved. He stood planted like stone. Ears up, gaze locked, not at the bags, not at the man, at the boy. A female officer approached, gently crouching to meet Micah at eye level. "What's your name, sweetheart?" she asked softly, her voice almost melodic. No response. "You like that teddy bear?" She tilted her head slightly, hoping to catch the boy's eyes. Not a blink. Thomas interjected, his voice calm. "He's a little shy. He's been through trauma? Please don't pressure him." The cold detachment in how he said "he" instead of "my boy" didn't go unnoticed by Jude. And once again, the boy's eyes didn't move. They stayed fixed on the air in front of him, as if he were staring through everything and everyone. Jude gripped the folder in his hand and exhaled slowly. "I understand. But because my working dog reacted, we'll need you to come with us to the private inspection area. It's just a short procedure." Thomas nodded without protest. He was still smiling. And the boy, Micah, still didn't react. They began walking down the side corridor that led to the isolation inspection zone. As the 3 of them passed the mirrored glass wall, Jude glanced sideways. And right there, in a flash of reflected light, he saw it clearly. The man hadn't looked at the boy once. Not like a father, not like a guardian, but like someone towing silent luggage. There was nothing wrong with the documents. Spread neatly across the inspection table, everything looked as though it had been prepared in advance. No folds, no smudged ink. A U.S. passport, crisp visa stamps, an intact barcode, no signs of forgery. A notarized guardianship document from a Texas court, complete with a case number and even a certified extract from local administrative records. The man's name was Thomas Whitmore. The child's name was Micah Whitmore. The file also included a medical declaration, a travel reason, booking confirmation, and an international flight itinerary from Atlanta to Brussels, with a continued leg to Geneva for special trauma recovery therapy for children. It was a believable reason. Perfectly worded. Without a flaw. Jude flipped through each page, eyes moving steadily just as they always did during document checks. But something in his mind didn't align. Not because the data was false, but because it was all too precise. Thomas sat still, his hands resting lightly on his knees. His eyes occasionally flicked toward Sable, as if assessing whether the dog had been properly trained. He didn't appear nervous. He didn't defend. He didn't avoid eye contact. If this were a movie, Thomas would be the kind of character that left the audience uneasy. Too perfect, to the point of being chilling. And in the corner of the room, Micah stood motionless. He wasn't restrained. He wasn't locked in place or told to stand there. But he didn't move. Didn't sit. didn't ask to leave. Jude glanced past the glare of the reflective glass. The boy hadn't changed position since entering, still holding the worn teddy bear, head tilted slightly, eyes open but focused on no one. No sadness, no fear, no resistance. Just emptiness. That wasn't the look of a sulking child, nor the timidness of a shy boy. It was a gaze drained of whatever was left of his human presence, replaced by a state of sheer endurance. Emily Hayes, the social worker called in for temporary observation, approached Micah with the care of someone who'd spent years working with trauma-affected children. She knelt beside him, aligning her knees with his feet. She didn't touch him, didn't rush. She simply sat, present. "Micah," she said softly, just loud enough to float through the stillness. The boy didn't move. She tried again. "Are you tired? Would you like some water?" Still. No motion. No turn of the head. No nod. No shake. Only the hand clutching the bear, tightened slightly, then loosened, then tightened again. That single motion repeated 3 times in the next 5 minutes. At the opposite table, Jude addressed Thomas in a respectful tone. "All documents are valid, but under special inspection protocol, we'll need verification from the European facility that will be receiving the child." Thomas smiled, nodded, and showed no resistance. "Of course, everything can be verified. I understand you're just following protocol. Thank you for your professionalism." Jude noted the agreeable tone, but didn't feel any relief. Something about this man's communication was too smooth, as if he had scripted every move, from expressions to phrasing to the timing of each pause. No flaws, but also no breath. And Micah had no voice. "Does the boy have any notable psychological history?" Jude asked, flipping through the medical section. Thomas answered like he'd rehearsed it. "Micah lost his mother at a young age. He was abandoned, showed signs of fearing strangers, especially female voices. I've tried to stabilize him over the past few years." Emily glanced at Jude, her brow furrowed. Something in that account didn't match the earlier records. "You said a few years?" she asked gently. Thomas didn't miss a beat. "I began the process when Micah was 3. He's 5 now. That includes the temporary care period." Emily nodded, but her eyes no longer trusted entirely. Jude stepped away from the table and moved toward Micah. Sable remained by the boy's side, quiet, still, watching, waiting. "Micah," Jude said softly, his voice as gentle as if speaking to an old friend. "You know, Sable only barks when it's something important. You heard him bark earlier, didn't you?" The boy didn't react. But his finger brushed lightly over the bear's head. Just once. And Sable, as if answering, lifted his head slightly, bringing it closer to the boy's thigh. Still not touching. That moment, only a few seconds long, was louder than any word in the file. Documents could match, but a child's eyes couldn't be faked. Jude sat down, his eyes resting on the final line of a psychological report he had read the previous year. Deeply wounded children don't scream. They go silent and wait. Wait for someone to see what they no longer have the strength to say. Jude looked up. He gazed once more through the glass. Micah was still standing there, silent, and his eyes still did not belong to the place his body occupied. He didn't shift his stance. He didn't glance around. There was none of the usual weariness seen in children kept waiting too long. No restlessness, no whining, no tears, just emptiness. A kind of emptiness Jude had encountered before, though rarely. It resembled the look found in conflict zones, when a child stands inside the rubble of a collapsed home, their parents gone, no one offering any explanation, and the sounds of their inner world have been utterly erased. And the boy standing before him now, in that small inspection room, carried exactly that same gaze. "Have you ever hugged him?" The question made Thomas raise an eyebrow slightly. "Excuse me?" Jude repeated, slower this time. "Since you became his guardian, have you ever held him?" Thomas gave a faint smile. "I don't think that kind of emotional display is necessary. I care for him, feed him, take him on every trip. Those actions say more than a hug, don't they?" Jude didn't answer, but inside something began to stir, slowly, like smoke. A doubt that didn't come from what was said, but from what wasn't. He pulled up the airport's security footage. The moment Thomas held Micah's hand as they passed through the checkpoint, then walked toward the boarding gate. The boy wasn't walking with his father. He was being towed, not led. And the man never looked down, not from being busy, not from stress. He simply didn't bother, as if it wasn't necessary. Out in the corridor, Sable was still in the exact same spot. In front of Inspection Room 2, the dog hadn't moved. An hour had passed. Staff had rotated shifts. Others had come and gone. But Sable hadn't sat down, hadn't turned his head, hadn't taken his eyes off that door. Whenever someone passed by, he would tilt his head briefly, checking, then immediately return to his previous stance. His front legs stayed locked, tail relaxed, ears erect like twin biological antennae attuned to detect the slightest unusual sound. Emily walked past a second time, holding a cold coffee, and stopped when her eyes caught the scene. "He's still there?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Jude stepped out from the room, the door shutting softly behind him. He looked at Sable, then let out a breath. "He hasn't moved for even a second. It's like he's guarding a door, not with force, but with faith." Emily quietly sat on the nearby bench. "You trust Sable's instinct?" "It's not instinct," Jude replied. "It's reflex, like memory stored in the body." He sat beside Sable, saying nothing. The dog's eyes remained fixed on the doorframe. "He once saved me during a narcotics sweep," Jude said softly. "Every scanner missed the shipment, but he sat down in front of the bag. Didn't bark, didn't move. Inside was a packet of pills hidden inside battery casings." Emily nodded. "And this time?" Jude looked through the glass again. This time, he didn't detect a banned substance. He sensed a child who doesn't know he has the right to make a sound. Inside the room, Thomas was on his phone. Not in secret, but his fingers moved fast and precisely. Jude stepped in and glanced at the screen. A string of encrypted messages had just been sent. He immediately ordered the phone to be seized, and the communication line blocked. "What are you hiding, Thomas?" Jude asked, his voice dropping to a level that no longer carried courtesy. Thomas didn't answer, but for the first time, his composure cracked. Sweat began to form at his temples. Sable leaned forward toward the door. His ears twitched, nose inhaled deeply, and for the first time since he had started standing guard, a low growl rumbled from his throat. Emily stood up. "He hears something." "No," Jude said softly. "He senses someone about to break." Jude turned to look at Micah. The boy still didn't speak, but this time, there was a subtle shift. His hands released the teddy bear, letting it rest on his lap, and his fingers gently touched the tabletop in front of him, as if testing the surface of something unfamiliar. Jude murmured to Emily, "Give the boy paper and crayons. Don't ask him anything. Just hand them over." Emily nodded. Sable remained at the door. He didn't flinch. That door, at that moment, was no longer just a boundary between an inspection room and a hallway. It had become the border between a truth about to take shape and a fear on the verge of being unmasked. And the only being willing to stand between those two worlds was a dog. A dog who had never barked without cause. A dog who didn't need commands to act. A dog who didn't need to know the child's name, only to know that no one had ever truly called him by it. Emily entered the room carrying a stack of A4 paper and a small box of crayons. Not expensive, not in a shiny case, just a worn cardboard box, reused from previous trauma sessions with children. She said nothing. She pulled up a plastic chair beside Micah. Not directly in front of him, but diagonally, just enough to be present without pressure. The boy didn't turn his head, didn't look at the box, but the tiny hand resting on the teddy bear's head stopped moving. Emily placed the first sheet on the table. Then, without a word, she took a single brown crayon and set it down gently on the corner of the paper, near Micah's right hand. She didn't urge, didn't say, draw, didn't explain anything. She simply sat. In silence. 12 minutes passed. The only sounds were the steady ticking of the air conditioning above and the white light humming from fluorescent tubes overhead. Micah still didn't move, but his eyes began to land on the crayon. Not directly, just a glance. Brief. Once. Then he looked away. On the third glance, Emily gently moved the box of crayons, sliding it closer, just enough to touch his elbow. And then, he picked one up. Not the brown crayon, but the black one. Micah placed the tip against the paper. It wasn't a straight line. It was a circle. Then 2 pointed ears. A long body, 4 legs, a tail, arched upward. Emily watched the image slowly appear. A dog. Not detailed, but clear enough to recognize that this was the first image the boy chose to name something inside himself. The crayon moved slowly, but his hand did not tremble. He didn't look up, didn't search for a reaction. He just drew, as if pulling memories out from a place long locked. When the dog was finished, he paused, then switched to blue. He drew a long rectangle, 2 short wings, square windows. An airplane. No one spoke. No one even breathed. Jude, watching through the glass, didn't need sound, because everything was being spoken in color and silence. Then came the skin-toned crayon. Micah picked it up and drew right in the center of the page, beneath the airplane. A figure. He began with the head, round, with ears, the collar of a shirt. But when he reached the face, Micah didn't draw eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a blank face, as if it didn't matter, or didn't exist. Emily pressed her lips together. She had seen children draw monsters with jagged lines or black out their faces in anger. But Micah didn't do that. He left it blank. And that emptiness was more frightening than any distorted form. When the drawing was finished, he didn't hand it over. He didn't turn the paper toward Emily. He simply pushed it forward slightly, pulled his hand back, and rested his arms on the table. His head tilted, eyes looking down toward the lower right corner. Emily waited a moment, then lightly touched the edge of the paper. She turned it gently to get a clearer view. A dog, an airplane, and a man with no face. She didn't ask. She just placed her hand on the table, near him, but not touching. "He's telling a story," she whispered, almost to herself. Jude entered the room after requesting permission. He sat far enough not to invade the moment. He looked at the drawing, then at Micah. The boy didn't turn his head. But his eyes, for the first time, shifted slightly toward Sable, who was still sitting just outside the door. Jude stood up, opened the door, called softly, "Sable!" He didn't need to call twice. The dog entered, moving slowly, as if he understood this space required no noise. He walked over to Micah. Didn't jump, didn't lick. He just sat beside the boy's chair and gently rested his muzzle on the child's knee. Micah didn't pull away, didn't panic. He placed his hand on Sable's head. For the first time. Without hesitation. Emily looked over at Jude, her eyes beginning to well. That's the first touch. From a child who's lived too long in a world where no one could be trusted. Jude nodded, saying nothing. Some moments don't need words. Only silence to honor the silence, just broken. Emily turned back to Micah. She didn't move her chair, didn't adjust her position. She simply shifted a little closer, just enough for him to know she was still there, but not enough to make him feel trapped. On the table lay the drawing, a dog, a plane, and a man without a mouth, still between them like a quiet testimony no one dared disturb. Emily gently touched the corner of the paper. She didn't lift it. She didn't ask, "What did you draw?" She just touched one image. The dog. "Is this you?" she asked softly, her voice like breath. Micah nodded. Slowly. Very slowly. But clearly. For the first time, he confirmed something through his own action. Emily didn't smile. She simply placed her hand over her chest, as if moved by instinct, then shifted her gaze to the faceless figure beneath the plane. "And this one?" She touched the image without a face. "Is that your dad?" Micah clenched the crayon in his hand. Once. Twice. Then he let go. The crayon fell onto the table with a sound so faint it was barely audible. But in that room, it rang like an explosion. Micah bowed his head, wrapped his arms around Sable a little tighter. And then, in a voice as thin as wind slipping through a crack in the door, he said, "No." Emily shivered, not because of the answer, but because of how it was spoken. A single word, but one that had passed through more scars than most ever know. Jude tightened his hands on his knees. Emily stayed where she was. No comforting words, no more questions. She simply let the answer hang in the air long enough for no one to dare deny it. Sable didn't move. The dog kept his head on Micah's knee, like a pillar standing firm against the wind. Still, but holding steady. Micah blinked. Once. Emily saw it. His eyes didn't glisten with tears. Nothing fell. But they opened wider, as if in that moment a beam of light had finally broken through a dusty layer of glass. Jude stepped outside. He didn't need to hear more. From that moment, the case had shifted. It was no longer about verifying documents, no longer about matching records, no longer about explanations from a courteous man. It was about rescuing a child from a prison with no walls. Outside, the door closed gently behind him. He pulled out his phone and called the data department. "Match Micah Whitmore's passport with the Interpol database. Priority level 1. Cross-reference with any missing child cases with matching images." The voice on the other end confirmed. While waiting, Jude walked back toward the hallway, where Sable had once stood for an hour without moving. That space was now quiet, like a memory freshly rewritten. He stopped in front of the door, placed his hand gently on the metal handle. The cold steel felt like a thin blade. Emily was still in the room. She took another blank sheet, said nothing, just slid it toward Micah, along with the crayon box. Micah glanced at it, didn't reach for it right away. "Does Sable have any friends?" Emily asked, directing the question to no one in particular. "Just enough to open a safe space." Micah turned to look at Sable. This time, his gaze was no longer empty. There was searching in it, a forming question. Presence. He picked up a crayon, orange, and began to draw. A collar around the dog's neck. At that very moment, out in the hallway, Jude received a message from the data team. Match confirmed. Micah Morrow, French citizen, missing from Marseille. Reported 73 days ago by biological mother, Iris Morrow. The name appeared like a beam of light cutting through the thickest clouds. He typed his reply immediately. Contact Interpol. Activate emergency reunification protocol. Is the mother alive? The message came back. Yes, under protection in France. Ready to travel upon official request. Jude tightened his grip on the phone. His eyes stung slightly, not from exhaustion, but because a crack had opened and light was coming through, and he knew he wasn't alone. Behind that door, a child had just named the truth. A woman had been waiting for more than 2 months for someone to believe her. And a dog had just turned silence back into speech. Marseille, France. A room with nothing remarkable. White walls with chipped paint near the window frame. On the table, a cup of cold tea and a faded photograph. A woman with curly hair sitting beside a smiling boy, around 3 years old. His arms wrapped around a teddy bear, his cheek resting on her shoulder. Iris Morrow no longer looked at the picture. She knew every detail by heart, every fold in her son's shirt collar, every reflection of light in the corners of her own eyes. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers intertwined. They didn't tremble, but something inside her had long stopped moving, as if each breath was only enough to keep her posture upright, not to live. The last time she saw her son was a Wednesday morning. They had walked to the local street market. Micah had asked for a strawberry ice cream. Iris said, "After lunch, sweetheart." He had pouted, kicked at a tree trunk. But 5 minutes later, he held her hand again. They never made it to the fruit stall. Micah let go of her hand and vanished. No scream, no struggle. No one saw anything. Iris shouted. She ran frantically through the market. She asked every person, every vendor. But the eyes that met hers weren't the eyes of witnesses to grief. They were the eyes of doubt. 2 hours later, Iris stood in the local police station. She had no husband, no relatives, no witnesses, just a paper form, and a blurry photo taken on an old phone. "Are you sure your son didn't run off on his own?" one officer asked, leaning back in his chair. "Do you have any psychological conditions? Any custody disputes recently?" Iris answered each question, calmly, steadily, breath by breath, but every word bounced off invisible glass. There was no one on the other side to receive them. "We'll look into it. There's not enough evidence to open an abduction case. You should go home. We'll call you if anything turns up." They never called. Not once. Even though she called every day. Even though she wrote formal requests. Even though she waited outside the police station gates for hours. 73 days. She couldn't remember the last night she'd slept. She stopped making coffee, stopped turning on the kitchen light. But she never removed her son's bedsheet. Never moved his pillow. Because the scent of him was the last thing she could still hold on to. Then one day, someone from a humanitarian organization came to her door. They said, "There's been a sign." They made no promises. only said that a child named Micah Morrow had appeared in a verification process in Atlanta, USA. He hadn't spoken, but he had drawn, and drawn the exact dog from the bedtime storybook she used to read him. Iris didn't cry when she heard. She only sat straighter, her eyes opened wider. And for the first time, her hand reached out to touch the suitcase that had sat untouched in the corner for 2 months. Atlanta. Jude stepped out of the Family Protection Office, holding an official document. He signed the activation order for emergency reunification, under the UN Convention for Missing Children. A special aircraft would bring Iris within the next 12 hours. He checked the time. It was past midnight. But inside him, something had just been set in motion. Not a protocol, a promise. Inside a private room at the center, Micah had fallen asleep. Sable lay at the foot of the bed. No command had been given, no light needed. He simply lay there, breathing steadily, like waves brushing a distant shore. Emily stepped quietly inside. She pulled the blanket gently over the boy's shoulder. Micah didn't wake, but his hand still rested near Sable's head. As if the boy knew, when he woke, something would have changed. In Marseille, in the holding area for the special flight, Iris sat close to the window. Her eyes didn't leave the night outside, even though nothing was visible beyond the glow of street lamps against fogged glass. She closed her eyes, for the first time in days, and in that brief moment, she saw Micah smile. Not in a photo, not in a memory, but in the future. The sound of a distant boarding call echoed, fading from her ears like the end of a dream. In the darkness behind her eyelids, the dream brought her back to that day. She saw herself standing in the street market, hands empty, back damp with sweat, sunlight cutting across her knees. She ran past the orange stall, the cheese stall, circling back again, calling Micah's name, louder and louder until her throat gave out. No one stopped. No one asked if she needed help. One man selling antiques even muttered with a smirk, "Kids, they just love to hide." She didn't know how long she had run. By the time her steps slowed, her knees were bleeding. She collapsed onto the steps of a public phone booth, hands trembling as she dialed the police. At the station, she spoke French that wasn't quite fluent. Her Moroccan heritage colored her accent. Her voice was fast, broken, repeating the words "mon fils" more times than she could count. The officer on duty, a woman, interrupted her with a flat tone. "Do you have evidence that the child was kidnapped? Any security footage, witnesses, threats?" Iris shook her head. He just disappeared. Just now. Less than an hour ago. The woman nodded slightly and looked up at the wall clock. "Minors cannot be reported missing until after 24 hours if there are no special circumstances." Iris stood still for a moment. 24 hours? If I wait 24 hours, who will still have seen my boy? She tried to hold back her tears. "Please, he's only 5. The officer opened a drawer, pulled out a form, and placed it on the cold metal table. "Fill this out. We'll file it, then wait for processing." Iris went to 3 different police stations over the next 3 days. Each one asked for copies of the birth certificate, legal custody papers, residency permits, and something no one said aloud but she could always feel, a lawyer. But she didn't have a lawyer, no money to hire one. Her ex-husband had disappeared when Micah was only 18 months old, never sent a cent of support, never a single message. Her dream dragged her through long hallways that smelled of mildew, where she sat on plastic chairs lined against walls, waiting for an authorized officer to review the file. She clearly remembered a man in a blue shirt placing an uncapped pen on the desk and saying, "You can't prove the disappearance wasn't voluntary. No cameras, no signs of struggle. Maybe the boy just wandered off." "He's 5," Iris whispered. Sometimes children are more clever than we think. And you seem overly sensitive. Have you ever been diagnosed with any trauma-related conditions?" That sentence was the final blow. In her dream, Iris saw herself stand up. Not crying, not screaming, just staring straight at them, turning to stone. A mother turned to stone in the eyes of the system, because she didn't fit the model they found easy to believe. No wedding ring, no perfect accent, no evidence, only a heart and a scream and a fear no one considered enough to act on. A beep from the airport intercom brought Iris out of her thoughts. She blinked once and exhaled. Her hand tightened around the strap of her bag. Inside, a blurred photo, laminated again in clear plastic, an unsent letter, and the little shirt her son had left in the laundry basket that final morning. She stood up, no longer crying, no longer stone. Now just a mother, this time with someone who believed her. On the other side of the ocean, in a silent interrogation room at Atlanta International Airport, flickering fluorescent light hovered over a cold metal table where Thomas Whitmore sat with arms crossed. His suit was still intact, but his collar was undone, his forehead damp with sweat, and his composure crumbling, bit by bit. Jude Reyes sat across from him, a file open but untouched. He didn't need more data. He needed the truth. Truth Thomas no longer had the strength to conceal. Jude's voice wasn't raised. It wasn't harsh. It was steady and slow, like water dripping in a silent room. Micah Morrow, 5 years old. Missing from Marseille 73 days ago. You brought him into the United States using a forged passport, guardianship documents from a local Texas court, fabricated outside of federal procedures. Thomas didn't deny it. He simply shifted in his seat, leaning back. A man whose mask had been stripped away, now left with nothing but dry logic, trying to dress itself in moral fabric. The boy needed a chance, Thomas said, almost whispering, his eyes fixed on an indistinct point on the table. A life his biological mother couldn't give him. Jude looked up, nodding slowly. So you decided you had the right to choose that for him? Thomas met his gaze. For the first time, his eyes reacted. No one else was doing anything. The system abandoned him, a child wandering unprotected. I saw that, and I acted. You saw a child walking with his mother, and you acted, Jude corrected, his voice calm but sharp as a blade. Silence followed. A soft whistle of wind filtered through the auxiliary door, sounding eerily familiar, like a scream no one heard in the Marseille market 73 days ago. Thomas tapped his finger lightly on the table. She was unfit. I watched her, I knew. She lived alone, no stable job, no lawyer, no one to speak for her. If I hadn't stepped in, that boy would have grown up in emotional chaos, in poverty and instability. I took him out of that. I gave him a future. Jude didn't move, but inside those words, a future rang like hollow metal, cold, hard, empty. What kind of future begins by erasing memory? What kind of future begins with a false identity? And what kind of future begins by teaching a child that his mother is dead? Thomas didn't reply right away, but his eyelid twitched. Jude sat upright, placing his hand gently on the file. You say you wanted the best for Micah, but you haven't looked him in the eyes once during the 2 hours you've been in custody. You haven't hugged him. You haven't comforted him. You didn't even ask how he was. And when someone asked, "Is that your father?" the boy let go of the crayon and whispered, "No." A slight twitch at Thomas's jawline. His hands clenched, not out of remorse but because he realized the child he thought could be programmed had broken free with a single word. You used to work in private security, didn't you?" Jude asked, shifting to a formal tone. There are records of unusual wire transfers from accounts in Texas, Luxembourg, and Dubai. Has anyone else ever helped children like Micah? Thomas said nothing. Sweat began collecting at his hairline. You're not acting alone, are you? Jude continued, his voice measured. You're part of a chain, a covert network, operating under the guise of child rescue to re-establish control through a legal front. You're not the first, and Micah won't be the last. This time, Thomas looked up, and in his eyes, for the first time, there was no logic, no rationalization, only fear, not of the law, but because the truth had slipped beyond his control. Jude stood, closed the file. Your reasons don't change the reality. Your reason was just a mask. You didn't save anyone. You stole something that wasn't yours and wrapped it in a beautiful label. Thomas lowered his head. He said nothing. Jude stepped out. Before closing the door behind him, he said, not to anyone in particular. A child doesn't need someone to replace his mother. He needs his mother, and this time he'll hear her voice again, calling him by his real name. Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, Internal Security Gate, 8:43 p.m. The overhead speakers echoed down from the ceiling, blending with the sound of rolling suitcases, plastic wheels gliding across polished floors, and scattered conversations in dozens of languages. No one turned their head for the woman with disheveled brown hair racing down the escalator, almost at a run. Iris Morrow held in her hand a printed clearance document with faded English words. Special clearance, reunification protocol, child identified Micah Morrow. She wasn't sure she understood all the words, but she recognized the name. His real name. And that was enough to push every fear to the bottom of her chest, leaving room for only one thing: a heartbeat that was ragged, urgent, and undeniable. She rushed past 2 security checkpoints. A guard stepped forward, raising a hand reflexively. Ma'am, this area is— I am the mother. My son, Micah. He's here. He was missing. Her voice cracked in rhythm, sentences tangled in French and English. The guard froze, confused. He repeated, Do you speak English? Slow down, please. I'm his mother, she said louder. His name is Micah Morrow. She held out the paper, her hand shaking, her throat caught in a language no one needed to translate. The panic of a woman who had once lost her child. Another officer approached. A young black woman in a pale blue uniform glanced at the paper, then at Iris. Hey, this is from the DOJ case file, isn't it, Micah? Oui, yes, Iris nodded rapidly. C'est mon fils. Please, I need to see him, please. The woman nodded, but gestured gently for Iris to step back. Okay, just wait a second. We need to call someone. Iris didn't understand everything, but she stopped. She stepped back toward the wall near the checkpoint counter, leaning against the cold glass, her eyes sweeping across the hallway, as if her boy might walk through any of the doors. Every child that passed made her heart clench. But none had the right face. None walked the way he did. None held a teddy bear with a frayed patch on the left shoulder. A tall security officer arrived. He spoke into his radio, then turned to Iris. Ma'am, come with me. Your son is safe. He's here. You'll see him soon. Iris looked at him, uncertain if she understood everything, but she recognized that look. It wasn't the look of suspicion from the Marseille police. It wasn't pity. It was the look of someone who believed her. They led her through a long hallway. Fluorescent lights reflected dimly off white tile floors. Every footstep echoed in her ears like knocks on the door of her heart. She didn't know how far she had walked, only that each step felt like a day she had lost. And this corridor was the bridge between 73 days and one word. Mama. A door opened. Jude Reyes stood there, no longer the officer, no longer the interrogator. Just a witness, a man who had seen a storm pass and knew the most important things weren't written in any report. "Iris Morrow?" She nodded. Jude spoke slowly. "Your son is in the family center. He's safe. He's been waiting. But I need to prepare you. He hasn't said much, not until recently. But he's not afraid anymore." Iris didn't respond. She tightened her grip on her bag. Her chest rose and fell with deep, held breaths. Jude guided her down a smaller hallway. A window revealed the room inside. Soft yellow light, a chair, a cloud-patterned rug. Micah was there, teddy bear in his arms, Sable lying beside him, head resting on the boy's leg like a sleepy bodyguard. Iris stopped. Her knees weakened. Her hand grabbed the doorframe. She didn't dare open it, not because she was afraid, but because this was the first time she had seen her son alive, after 73 nights of seeing him die in her mind. "Can I?" Jude nodded. "You don't need permission anymore." She pushed the door open. No sound, only footsteps on the carpet, and the short breaths of someone who had been holding hers for too long. Micah looked up. His eyes widened, and for 1 second the world stopped turning. Then came the sound, not a scream, not a sob, but a single word, hoarse, trembling, yet clear as light through darkness. "Mama." One word. But in that room, it rang like a bell striking the heart, awakening everything buried beneath doubt, fear, and 73 days of silence. Iris didn't run. She flew across the space between memory and loss, through the cold of nights without the sound of her son's breathing, past the rejection slips, the skeptical glances, and every hour spent in soulless government offices where no one met her eyes. She dropped to her knees, wrapped her arms around Micah, without needing to know whether his arms would lift in return. Because a mother doesn't hug to be hugged back. She hugs to prove that her flesh and blood is still breathing. Micah didn't resist, nor did he collapse into his mother's arms like other children might. He simply stood still. His arms hung loose, his eyes wide, as if unable to catch up with the overwhelming wave of emotion unfolding around him. Everything came too fast, too real, too warm, so much so that he didn't know what to do with it, except stand still and wait for himself to believe. And then 2 tears rolled down his small cheeks. Slow, silent, no sobbing, no expression. Just drops, melting from a place that had been frozen too long, now thawing in a way he didn't yet know how to handle. Outside the terminal, beyond the thick glass and the soft glide of footsteps across polished floors, the song "What Are Words" began playing from the ceiling speakers. No one knew who selected it. No one noticed it at first. But in the moment the mother and child embraced, the first lyrics echoed like a voice from another soul. What are words if you really don't mean them when you say them? The voice was low, drawn out, resonating through the walls of time. No one in that room spoke, but the song seemed to do it for them. What are words if they're only for good times, then they don't? Iris held the boy tighter. Her hands trembled. Not from fear, but because in that moment, she could feel her son's ribs pressing against her chest, and she knew he was really, truly still here. Not in a photo, not in a dream, but in warmth, in pulse, in breath. When it's love, yeah, you say them out loud. Those words, they never go away. The song continued, not too loud, not demanding attention. But to Iris, it was the voice of a heart that had once screamed in vain, and to Micah, It was a lullaby from something he had forgotten the name of. Trust. She didn't speak, didn't ask, "Do you remember me?" Didn't repeat "Mama" as if needing more proof. She just held Micah as if letting go would collapse the world all over again. And in that embrace, the boy didn't smile, didn't cry out. He just listened. Listened to his mother's heartbeat. Listened to his own breathing respond. Listened to the song, intentional or not, saying what both of them could not. They live on even when we're gone. Sable stood behind them, ears perked, still, eyes fixed on the door, but his tail wagged. Once, softly, as if translating the lyrics, not into words, but into instinct. Loyalty needs no language, love needs no repetition, and a promise needs no declaration, only the right soul, at the right time, with the right heart. Sable remained there, in the same spot, just a few steps from the chair. He didn't bark, didn't jump in joy, didn't break the silence with any excited reaction. He stayed alert, ears up, back straight, eyes half-lidded, but every muscle mapped that room as conditionally safe. Only one thing had changed: Sable's tail. It wagged gently, not fast, not eager, just one beat, then paused, then one more. Like a heart returning to life, not rushing but cautious, as if the dog was saying, "We still need to be careful, but at least tonight we can breathe." That evening, at the Family Protection Center, a small room was prepared for the mother and child. The twin bed was replaced with a double, fresh blankets, an amber nightlight. And beside the bed, Sable was allowed in without asking. Emily stood in the doorway, watching the scene like a painting she knew she'd never forget. Micah, nestled against his mother, his head resting on Iris's chest, still holding his old teddy bear, not to shield himself this time, but to share space with someone else. Iris placed her hand on his forehead, brushing his hair gently, a habit she hadn't dared to do even in dreams for the past 2.5 months. And Sable, he lay right beside the bed, not curling around their heads, not squeezing onto the warm rug, but placing himself where he could see both the door and the child's breath. Lying on his side, front paws parallel, ears still up, tail curled in, eyes closed, but his ears never slept. Outside, the wind picked up. A security light flickered once in the hallway. A distant siren sounded from the airport grounds, then dissolved into the night. Sable didn't move. He stayed there, motionless, like part of the room's architecture, like a lock that needed no key, like a biological alarm that required no wiring, like a promise. That, if someone comes to take you again, this time I won't let it happen. A mother had awakened from a nightmare. A child had been called by his real name. And a dog, without needing to be told, had chosen to keep his promise all night, never looking away from the space in front of the door. The next morning, at 6:15 a.m., a center staff member entered with a breakfast tray. They didn't dare knock, only opened the door slightly and froze. In the soft golden light, the mother still slept, arms wrapped around her child. Micah hadn't turned his back, hadn't tensed his body. He slept with relaxed legs, his cheek pressed into the collar of her shirt, as if every cell had returned to where it belonged. And Sable still lay there, in the same position. Only his eyes had been open for a while, and his gaze still fixed on the door. When the staff member stepped back, Sable glanced once, then wagged his tail. He didn't bark, didn't rise, just wagged, like saying, "I know, but don't wake them. They're sleeping for the first time as a family." Federal Courthouse, 3rd floor, hearing room 6. No cameras, no journalists, No press crowding the door like in usual hearings. The witness protection order had been signed at 3 a.m. Micah was now classified as a minor survivor of a cross-border abduction. No images permitted. No statements allowed outside the courtroom until the session was complete. Judge Audrey Lynn, an Asian American woman in her 50s, known for her uncompromising rulings in child abuse cases, sat upright at the bench. Her face was bare, no makeup. Her glasses were thick, but her gaze was sharp as a blade that needed no honing. Across from her sat Thomas Whitmore, his wrists bound by thin steel cuffs that didn't catch the light. His face looked thinner, his eyes sunken. No suit, no tie. Just a gray prison uniform, and a man who no longer controlled anything except his own breath. Iris Morrow entered. She wore a white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, plain slacks, and no makeup. No private attorney, no legal representative. Only presence, and her voice, heard clearly now for the first time, uninterrupted by procedure. She was called to the witness stand. Micah sat below, next to a child welfare specialist. He didn't hold a stuffed toy, but one of his hands rested gently on Sable's head, the dog lying quietly beneath him like a silent anchor. "Mrs. Morrow?" Judge Audrey nodded. "We've reviewed the full report, photographs, verified documents, and the evidence regarding Mr. Thomas Whitmore's removal of your son from European territory using falsified paperwork. But I want to hear it from you." Iris nodded. She didn't look at Whitmore. She looked at Micah. "For 73 days, I knocked on every door, police, legal aid, advocacy groups, but no one opened for me. I had no lawyer, no collateral, no one to confirm I was a good enough mother. All I had was my voice and an old photo." Her voice was steady, each word etched more than spoken. "They said I was paranoid. They told me to rest, that maybe my son had just wandered off somewhere, that I was overreacting." Micah lowered his head. His shoulders pulled inward, as if all the gazes in the courtroom made him want to disappear completely. Sable moved, just slightly, one paw shifted closer. He didn't rise, didn't lean in, just nudged a front paw forward by half a hand's length, enough for the boy's toes to lightly brush his fur. Not comforting, not cuddling, not like a household dog taught to nuzzle or whimper when its owner is sad. Sable didn't learn those things. He didn't need to. His instinct was always the same, to stand between threat and what must be protected, without needing a command. And in this moment, inside a federal courtroom thick with formality, where words, law, and authority fought to define what was right, Sable was the only pulse helping Micah stay grounded. He didn't look at Micah. He looked at the defendant's table. Sable's gaze was unnervingly firm. No growl, no bared teeth. But the way he raised his head, pointed his snout, and sharpened his ears mirrored exactly the stance he had taken that day in the airport, when he first sensed Micah was being taken from his world. If Sable hadn't barked that day, if Jude Reyes hadn't trusted his instinct, if that dog had stayed silent like part of the background, Micah wouldn't be here today, wouldn't have had the chance to say mama, wouldn't have drawn a dog, an airplane, and a man with no face. Sable was the first to notice what all the professionals, officials, and system access holders missed. He wasn't trained to empathize, but he sensed fear that had no scent, silence that was unnatural, and chose not to leave the door where Micah had been held. And now, in this courtroom with no cameras, no applause, no reporters, Sable was present once again, not to validate a statement, but to guard the truth from being taken again. Because he knew Micah was now closer than ever to freedom, to family, to his real name, spoken in a real voice, to a mother nearly erased by a system for lacking a lawyer and perfect pronunciation, And Sable would not let anyone, not one, destroy that. The shift in his paw wasn't just a gesture. It was a declaration in the language of bodies, solid, silent, but undeniable. I am here. I know you're scared. I brought you this far. And if anyone thinks they can pull you back into darkness, they'll have to go through me first. Sable needed no applause, no medal. He only needed to stay where he belonged, between the child and the world, between the one who caused the harm and the doorway to healing. Micah felt the shift. He didn't look down, didn't glance, but he slowly extended a finger and touched the fur on Sable's paw. Not to pet, just to touch. A silent message. I know. Thank you for not leaving. In that moment, every testimony faded. Every argument, every justification felt distant and hollow. Because truth doesn't need to be shouted. It only needs to be protected. And Sable was doing exactly that. Not with a bark, but with his presence, with his stillness, with the eyes of a bodyguard who needed no badge. Iris continued. That man, the one sitting there, had documents, degrees, money, and that was enough for people to believe him. She clenched her hands together. But Micah didn't speak, not because he was afraid, but because the world had convinced my son that no one was listening. Across the bench, Thomas closed his eyes, not in repentance, but to block out sounds he no longer had the power to erase. Mr. Whitmore, the prosecutor stood. We have records of a wire transfer between you and an account in Luxembourg. Copies of internal correspondence between law offices in Texas indicate you had legal backing. Do you wish to respond? Thomas exhaled. His chin trembled slightly. That boy was never going to have a future. I was just trying to fix what the system failed to do. That boy, Judge Audrey repeated, narrowing her eyes. You mean Micah? Thomas gave a slight nod. The courtroom fell utterly silent. The prosecutor stepped closer. That boy didn't smile for over 2 months, didn't speak, didn't resist, until he was given paper and crayons. He drew a dog, a plane, and a man without a mouth. Micah looked up, very slowly, as if aware they were speaking of him. Then, the prosecutor continued, we asked, Is this you? He nodded. We asked, Is this your father? And he threw the crayon. The prosecutor moved before the bench. And he said one word, no. No one spoke. No one moved. Only the soft rustle of fabric, the faint squeak of Sable's paw on stone. And then, Judge Audrey gently turned to Micah. Micah, she said, would you like to say something? Micah turned to Emily, the social worker. She gave a slight, reassuring nod. Micah bowed his head. Then, placed both hands on Sable's head. He whispered, barely audible. I didn't choose to go with him. I waited for my mom. And I knew, because Sable didn't leave the door. Midday sunlight streamed through the tall window. On the floor, the shadow of a dog stretched long and still. But in his steady breath, a broken justice system was beginning again. 3 hours later, the verdict was delivered. Thomas Whitmore, guilty of international abduction, document forgery, and violating the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. No bail. Permanent revocation of all guardianship rights. All custodial rights to Micah were restored to Iris Morrow under federal legal protection. No applause, no cheers. Only Micah, who stood up, one hand holding his bear, the other resting on Sable's head, whispering, We're going home now, the night after the trial. There was no longer the echo of a gavel ringing through a cold chamber. No more paperwork, no more evidence. No more judgmental glances that cut through messy hair, thin arms, and mispronounced words. only the soft amber glow of a nightlight on the wall, casting shadows of 3 living beings sharing one sleep. Iris, her breathing slowed for the first time in 2.5 months, not needing to wake in the middle of the night to cry. Micah curled against her, his small hand still gripping the worn teddy bear. And Sable, lying at the edge of the rug, not fully asleep, but his shoulders had relaxed, his legs tucked in for the first time. Emily stood outside, leaning against the doorframe. She didn't want to step inside. There was no need to disturb. She simply stood in stillness, like the final sentry at the edge of a space that had just begun to heal. And in that moment, memory returned, slow and clear, like waves drifting across an undisturbed lake. The first time the boy whispered, "No," it hadn't sounded like any refusal she had ever heard. It wasn't protest. It had no force, no color. It didn't leave his mouth. It dissolved from his heart, like a door that had never opened, finally exhaling. Like a hairline crack on frozen glass, not enough to break, but enough to let out a fragile, aching groan. No one in the room was sure he had spoken. Only Emily. She saw Micah's fingers grip the crayon, then let it fall. And in that instant, Sable shifted. No cue was given, no command. The dog raised his head and gently placed his muzzle on Micah's knee, not like an animal trained for emotional support, but like the only being who had heard the sound of a soul hitting bottom. He hadn't heard words. He had heard silence, not the suspicious silence of interrogation rooms, not the dead quiet of an empty space, but silence that had shape, silence that knew fear, silence that had a taste, silence like the color of ash after fire, not smoking, but still warm beneath. Emily had worked with hundreds of children, abused, abducted, forgotten. Some screamed unconsciously, some repeated one sentence hundreds of times, some drew eyes that never blinked. But Micah was different. He was so quiet. His presence felt like a dim bulb, not bright enough for anyone to notice, not dark enough for someone to think it needed fixing. And that was the most terrifying part. The way Micah existed, as if even he believed he wasn't worth being found. And then he dropped the crayon and whispered, "No, one word, one breath, one broken rhythm." But to Emily, it was the first drumbeat of a silent alarm. Sable reacted before she did. He didn't stretch, didn't make a sound. He only lifted his head, like a wolf that had learned the sound of snow cracking beneath the predator's feet. The way Sable positioned himself, not to interrupt, not to intrude, but to place his body in the only space that stood between the child and whatever waited beyond that room, made Emily shiver. Not because Sable was special, but because he understood. Silence does not mean absence. It only needs a different kind of ear. From that moment, Emily never looked at Sable the same way again. He wasn't just a working dog. He was the final boundary between a child pushed out by the system and the only thing that could call his soul back by name, a mother. She stepped away from the doorway. Outside, the air was crisp. A thin mist curled around the corridor leading to the back courtyard of the center. The instinct to protect someone does not come from protocol. It comes from listening. And listening does not begin with the ears. It begins with presence. Sable had heard that boy before anyone else had. He heard it in the way footsteps were dragged without notice. He heard it in an unfocused gaze that had no place to land. He heard it in the shallow breath just outside the interrogation room door, where the boy stood for 40 minutes, completely still. And now, with justice spoken, a mother returned, and the light opened up. Sable still lay there, beside the rug, not fully asleep. Because he knew, the most painful thing in the world is not the scream itself. It's when no one hears it. And if ever again someone stops listening, Sable will hear it first. The next morning, 6:12 a.m. The first sunlight of a new month filtered through the curtains of room 17 in the Family Protection Center. Iris was still asleep, her first dreamless sleep in 73 days. Micah was still nestled against his mother's chest, breathing evenly. The teddy bear had fallen to one side, but his hand still touched something else. Sable's front paw. No one placed it there. No one arranged it. They found each other, through the reflex of two beings whose voices had once been smothered. Emily stood outside the door. She didn't knock. She simply leaned in and clicked the shutter. No flash, no perfect framing, no lighting adjustment. Just a single moment, captured as if the heart of the whole story had just exhaled. A mother, sleeping on her side, holding her child. A child, no longer tense. A dog, no leash, no command, yet still in place. And the morning's golden light, painting the wall behind them with three overlapping silhouettes, like a map that needed no legend. The photograph had no title, and it didn't need a caption. Because anyone who's ever loved, ever lost, ever been misunderstood, or ever waited for someone to come back would understand the meaning in the first second. Not for the papers, not for the court, just to say, I was there, and it happened, and they found each other. That same day, Micah was issued new identification with his real name, Micah Marrow. Nationality? French. Iris signed the legal custodial form, and at the bottom, beside her signature, was a space. Other guardian figure, if applicable. She asked, "Can I write down a dog?" The clerk chuckled. "You write it. We'll take care of the rest." And so, under guardian figure, non-human, appeared a handwritten line. Sable, protecteur silencieux. Sable, the silent guardian. By late afternoon, the three of them left the center. Iris held Micah's hand with one arm, the leash in her other. Sable didn't walk ahead, nor did he lag behind. He walked exactly the right distance to keep both of them in his line of sight. They passed through a small park near the airport, a place that, for some reason today, had no one sitting on the benches. Micah sat down first. He said nothing. He simply pulled a small scrap of paper from his jacket pocket and started drawing something rough and childlike. Iris leaned over. It was a picture of a house. And beneath the roof, three round figures, one big, one small, and one with pointy ears. No one explained, no one needed to ask. Micah simply pushed the paper toward his mother, then bent down and wrapped his arms around Sable's neck, for the first time, tightly, not from fear, not from gratitude, but from understanding. If it weren't for you, I would have disappeared, and no one would have known. At the edge of the park, an aging photographer walked by. He paused for a few seconds, then quietly raised his camera. No request, no conversation. Just a professional instinct, when seeing three beings layered into the day's last light, like three distinct colors: trust, peace, and survival. A week later, a short column was published, excerpted from Atlanta Human Voice, Sunday morning edition, statewide release. The dog who disobeyed to save a child. There was no siren, no dramatic chase, no blood, no scream, just one bark, a single bark, that cut through the noise at Atlanta International Airport one morning last month, and a glance almost no one noticed. Because of that, a 5-year-old boy didn't disappear. A mother didn't live in doubt forever. And a dog, one who was never allowed to act without command, chose not to wait for anyone's permission. The boy's name is Micah Marrow, 5 years old. He went missing from a street market in Marseille, France, nearly 3 months ago. His mother's name is Iris Marrow, a single woman, without a lawyer, without an advocate, without anyone believing her. The man arrested, Thomas Whitmore, a private security advisor with a spotless resume that read like a training manual. And the dog, the reason this article exists, is Sable. Sable is a K9 service dog assigned to airport security. He had participated in over 30 inspection operations, known for his calm demeanor, sharp precision, and a reputation for never barking without reason. But that day, among the endless stream of passengers at Terminal 4, Sable barked. And kept barking. Not because of suspicious luggage, not because of drugs, but because of a well-dressed man holding the hand of a little boy. A boy who didn't smile, didn't speak, didn't react, didn't look at anyone. Officer Jude Reyes, the K-9 handler on duty with Sable that morning, recounted, "I've seen Sable react to narcotics hidden in nail polish bottles. But this time, there was no scent, no object, just a child, whose eyes didn't belong to himself." The boy had a passport. Name, Micah Whitmore. Legal guardian, Thomas Whitmore. Guardianship papers from Texas. Valid visa. Everything in order. But the boy didn't have his real name. He had a name created to justify a disappearance. Sable, by protocol, should not have reacted without a clear trigger. A service dog is trained to avoid false alarms, to stay silent unless there is cause. But that day, Sable didn't wait for a command. He stood between the man and the boarding gate. He guarded the interrogation room for nearly 40 minutes, never moving an inch. And during that time, the file was reopened, records re-examined, and the boy's real name was found. Micah Morrow, missing for 73 days, and no one believed. And had Sable not barked in that one moment, the boy would have passed security, boarded the plane, and disappeared without a trace. In the interview room, when handed drawing paper, Micah didn't cry, didn't tell a story. He just drew. A dog, a plane, and a man without a mouth. He didn't need to prove anything. It was enough that someone saw it, and the first one who did wasn't human. The trial took place in silence. No cameras, no live broadcast. Micah didn't testify with words, but he sat below, one hand resting on Sable's head. That alone was enough. Judge Audrey Lynn concluded, "In this case, it was a rule-breaking act that saved a life. A creature with no legal voice was the only one who heard the silent cry of a child." Sometimes, justice doesn't begin with reason. It begins with instinct, when that instinct is pure enough. We couldn't publish Micah's photo, nor could we film Iris, the mother, as she left the courthouse. But one photo, a single one, was taken by a passerby outside the building. In it, a child sits on the steps. Afternoon light touches his hair. He doesn't smile, doesn't wave, just rests a hand on the head of the dog lying close beside him, and the mother stands behind, looking at him. Not at the lens, just at her son. The photo needed no caption, because the headline of the article was the only explanation required: "The dog who disobeyed to save a child." The next day, Sable was nominated for the Medal of Courage for extraordinary service by the Department of Justice. And by the end of the day, Sable was officially registered as a legal member of the Morrow family. Their new home wasn't large. Gray facade, sloped tiled roof, a narrow porch overgrown with wildflowers. The backyard was just big enough for a wooden swing and a few rows of low-growing carrots. But there, everything breathed. No rush, no need to normalize, just a home where no one needed to prove who belonged to whom. Micah had his own room. Walls painted a soft blue, a window facing the sunrise, a new desk, new crayons, crisp white paper, and beside the desk, a round cushion for Sable. He still slept there, still raised his head whenever Micah stirred, still lay motionless each morning, eyes half open, ears alert, from dreams that never fully relaxed. A week after moving in, Micah began drawing again. At first, vague circles, then houses, doors, stairs, and skies with only a few clouds. But then Iris noticed, in every picture there were always two figures, a boy with light brown hair, and a dog wearing a cape. Not a red superhero cape, no S, no lightning bolt, just a piece of soft gray fabric draped behind the dog's neck, blowing to one side, as if the wind came from the boy's eyes in the picture. Iris remained silent each time he drew. She didn't ask, "Who is this?" She didn't say, "You're so talented." She simply laid a hand on his shoulder, just enough for him to know. "You don't need to say it. I see it." One early morning, dew still clung to the kitchen window. Iris gently rearranged a bunch of dried lavender in the glass jar on the sill. She did this every day, not because the flowers needed changing, but because her heart needed a steady rhythm, like a whisper to herself. "Everything is here. My child is here. This breath is real. I don't have to imagine anymore." Sunlight streamed through the sheer curtain, pouring onto her hand like soft golden honey. Everything was still. The house as calm as a canvas untouched by morning's first brush. And then, from behind, a voice spoke, clear, whole, no stutter, no whisper. "I'm going to hang this over my bed." Iris froze, her hand still resting on the jar. 1 second. 2. 3. Her heart began to race, not from fear, but because something fragile had just truly happened. Micah's voice, not a shattered no, not a reflexive murmur, but a sentence, with a subject, a verb, and a purpose, a declaration, a sharing, a wish. She turned slowly, as if afraid turning too quickly might break the moment. Micah stood in the living room. He held a drawing, a bit large for his small fingers, but steady, not trembling. His eyes looked at her, not shy, not searching, just waiting for his mother to hear. Iris stepped closer. She didn't ask, didn't touch. She just knelt down, eye level with her son. "Can I see it?" she whispered. Micah gave a small nod, then handed her the paper, like a gift, like a bridge tossed onto a river still veiled in mist. The drawing showed a house. On the roof, a boy sat cross-legged, holding a round lantern. Beside him, a dog with pointed ears gazed straight toward the horizon on the lantern. There was no glow, no shining beam, just a single yellow dot. Small, but vivid against the light blue and soft violet tones of the sketch. Iris looked at it, and in that moment, she felt something press against her throat, not to choke, but to keep her from crying out loud. Because she understood. That dot was the light Micah had found again. Not radiant, not big, not something that wiped out the darkness, but a light he had drawn himself. And that meant Micah had seen a way home, enough to light a lantern in his imagination. Iris looked up at her son. He was still waiting for her reaction. Not anxious, not unsure, just waiting. Because when a child has lived in a world where everything they say is treated as unworthy, they need someone who doesn't break the silence too soon. She placed a hand on Micah's shoulder, not to squeeze, then softly said, "I think it would look beautiful on the wall above your bed, but I also think that wall isn't just a wall. It's a place where you can begin to dream." Micah smiled. Not wide, not with sound. But his lips curved just enough to say, "This smile no longer needs to be hidden." He hugged the drawing, turned, and walked up the stairs to find a place to hang it. Iris remained kneeling on the floor, hands resting on her knees, watching him go. A single tear rolled down her cheek, as if someone had traced a beam of light on the white wall inside her. Not because Micah could speak, but because her son had wanted to speak, and believed that when he did, someone would listen. And that is the first breath of healing. Later that afternoon, the doorbell rang. Micah was sitting on the front porch, chin resting on his knees, drawing with wax crayons. The visitor was Jude Reyes, still in canine uniform, airport security badge on his left sleeve, name tag across his chest. Iris opened the door, pausing slightly. Not because she was surprised, but because it felt like time had stopped inside that uniform and ended right here. "He has a home now," Jude said. His eyes met hers, gentle, without the sharpness of someone once holding a leash on duty. Iris nodded. "They have each other now." Jude looked across the yard. Micah looked up, recognizing him, not afraid, not hesitant. He simply set the crayon down, stood up, and called out a name he had never spoken aloud before. "Sable!" The dog lifted his head immediately. Didn't lunge, didn't bark, just got up and walked straight toward Micah. No leash, no command. He touched his nose to the boy. A silent nudge, just enough to shift the moment, just enough to remind them that even in peace, someone is still standing guard. Then Sable stopped in the middle of the yard, where the afternoon light poured down, casting a beam across Jude Reyes's muted blue uniform. Jude knelt, not out of ceremony, not for show, but because Sable's line of sight was never beneath him. He only bowed when beside a child who needed protection. And now, this man in uniform knelt to meet the gaze of a loyalty that never asked for recognition. He placed a hand on Sable's forehead, where the bone still rose like the tip of an arrow, always pointed toward what must be guarded. "You broke the rules." Jude's voice softened, not as scolding, but like whispering to himself. A truth. A reminder. But you were right. Some sentences, when spoken, are no longer just words, but a certificate of truth that was once dismissed. Jude used to believe in rules, in leashes, in signals, in protocol, in radio-issued commands. He used to tell rookies, "Canine dogs have no feelings. They don't love, don't hate. They are tools, with breath, scent, and obedience." But then a dog barked, not on command, not because of explosives, not from a signal, but because he saw a child no one stood for. That day, Sable needed no clear signs, no signature. He simply raised his head and stepped out of the boundaries he had been trained to stay within. One step, one broken rule, one unprogrammed decision. But without that act, Micah would have never had a name again. And now Jude didn't need a training manual to understand that. He saw it in the boy's eyes, when his hand rested on the dog's head without anyone asking, "Are you sure he's safe?" He saw it in the calm, unhurried peace of the porch, where the sunset wasn't blocked by warnings, fences, or cold metal gates. Sable didn't growl, didn't whimper. He simply closed his eyes. For 2 seconds. 2 seconds were enough for everything he had heard, smelled, held onto, to be released in a single breath. Not from exhaustion, but from completion of a mission no human should have assigned him, but he had claimed it anyway. "Sleep well," Jude whispered, as if soothing a friend who needed no lullaby. "There's no need for alarms here." He gently tightened his grip around Sable's neck, not as a handler, not to impose rank, not to repeat roles. Just a farewell between two comrades who had stared toward the same place, but from two different origins. When Jude rose, Micah stepped closer and held out his hand. Jude looked and bent down. The boy placed a small sheet of paper in his palm, an unfinished drawing. A man, in uniform, stood between two figures, a child and a dog with a gray cape. Behind them, a house with light glowing in the window. Micah said only one thing. "I didn't get to draw the flashlight on your belt, but I know you have one." Jude didn't smile, didn't nod. He simply held the paper tighter and turned away. Sunlight swept across his shoulder. His shadow stretched long over the stone walkway, one human silhouette joined by a canine's, as if some final task hadn't left yet, still keeping watch at the gate to ensure this place, from now on, is home. 7 months after Micah was rescued, a formal invitation arrived at the Morrow residence from the European Commission in cooperation with Interpol, inviting mother and son to speak at the International Forum on Missing Children, held in The Hague. The forum gathered lawyers, investigators, psychologists, social advocates, and the rarest, most precious guests, survivors. When they arrived at the auditorium, Iris didn't wear formal attire, just a long indigo dress, a light scarf around her neck. Micah walked beside her, holding his sketchbook, something he now never let go of. Sable didn't come. The organization had requested it, but Iris knew. There was a distinct emptiness beside Micah's feet. And that child knew exactly who was holding his place. The hall bore classic architecture: red velvet seats, golden lighting, polished wood. Earlier panels had been packed with terms like chain analysis, covert attack models, and international law compliance. But when Iris stepped onto the stage, there were no slides, no charts, no music, just a mother and her son seated in the front row, drawing. He didn't look up, but his hands did not tremble. Iris began. No notes in hand, no script, just her voice. She stood alone under the spotlight, her brown hair tied neatly behind her head. No makeup, no filter, just a mother, representing no organization, wearing no title, but speaking with the weight of every unheard voice. I am not here to say thank you, not to celebrate anyone, not to describe what it feels like to lose your child. I am here to remind you that listening saves lives. The room froze. No one breathed deeply. No pens tapped. No phones buzzed. No one even blinked, as if afraid to miss a syllable that might redefine justice. I went to 3 police stations, brought photos, wrote petitions, stood in the rain, made dozens of phone calls, and not one person looked me in the eye. She paused. Not long, but enough. Enough for each person there to picture themselves as that woman, standing at a damp reception counter, clutching a rain-soaked paper, facing fingers typing away without ever looking up. They looked at my file. No husband, no lawyer, no influence, and that was enough for them to decide I wasn't worth believing. Micah stopped drawing. He didn't look up, but his legs curled tighter against his seat, like his entire body was gripping each word his mother spoke. On his knee, the sketchbook remained open, and the crayon still leaned, its wax tip resting against the page. Iris continued. Her voice didn't rise. She didn't need to build momentum. It remained level, like the surface of a lake, long ignored, now beginning to stir. I'm here because my son was saved, but not by the system, not by the law, but by a dog. A soft murmur swept the rows. Unexpected, but no one laughed. A creature with no voting rights, no legal standing, no title, no counsel, but he heard the silence no one else thought to analyze. At that moment, a single image formed in every mind. A dog, not wagging, not growling, standing firm in a stream of passengers at the airport, ears alert, eyes locked on a child being led away. While the security gates opened, green lights blinked, passport data processed in less than a second. That creature had no barcode, no access to databases, only a feeling that something wasn't right. The entire system, built on logic and procedure, had heard nothing, while a being who couldn't speak for himself had heard everything. Couldn't say, I believe this is wrong, yet silently responded to what the system deemed no direct harm. Not a single word Iris used to describe Sable was literal. She didn't name him. She didn't use the word hero. But in every pause between her sentences, everyone understood. That creature, without words, had spoken on behalf of a child who couldn't. We once defined intervention as a conditioned reflex, But sometimes salvation comes from the one with no conditions at all, except a heart that was never taught how to look away. A Belgian attorney, sitting in row 3, froze. Her pen dropped to the floor, not because the words were new, but because they were so true. They made every academic term she'd ever learned feel unnecessary. Iris took a breath. She stepped slightly back, as if to pull herself from the light now focused on her. We talk too much, but we don't listen enough. We demand evidence, but don't ask with our eyes. And we think systems save lives, while some beings just needed to be heard once to find a way to live. At that moment, no one took notes, no one typed. The entire hall felt like a memory someone had just touched at its deepest layer. They weren't listening to Iris recount a tragedy. They saw themselves in every policeman's shake of the head, in every stamp of insufficient grounds, in every glance over a child's drawing that should have been preserved as evidence. Iris quietly stepped down. No bow, no farewell, no thanks. Because when a mother speaks the truth from a heart that once shattered, she needs no applause. She only needs people to stop looking away. A soft movement stirred in the press row. A German judge set her pen down. A Canadian expert on trafficking covered her mouth. Iris lifted her head. Her voice didn't tremble, but her eyes were no longer addressing the room. If a dog can choose the right thing to believe in, then we, people with degrees and authority, have no excuse not to listen, no reason not to look into the child before judging the mother, and no justification to keep calling this a system failure, because the silence of the system isn't an accident, it's a choice. The entire hall rose in a standing ovation. But Iris didn't bow, didn't raise a hand to thank them. She simply returned to her seat beside Micah, and sat as if she had only been speaking to her child. 3 days later, an envelope arrived at their hotel room. No sender name, just a single line. A Madame Marot. Inside was a sheet of paper, handwritten in violet ink, slanted with an aged hand. I was one of the links in the chain that turned its back on you. I once signed the refusal to open a case on grounds of no clear evidence of harm. You don't know my name, but I remember your eyes when you left my desk, carrying that unsigned paper. That day you didn't cry, but today I did when I heard you say, "Listening saves lives." I do not ask for forgiveness. I only want you to know I've resigned, and I've begun to tell the truth. Signed at the bottom, Magali Bernard, Administrative Judge, Marseille. Iris said nothing after reading. She set the letter on the table, then turned to Micah, placing a hand on the back of his neck. The boy was still drawing. On the page was a microphone, placed on the ground, and behind it, a pair of ears, not human ears, not dog ears, just ears, wide open, listening into the silence. Iris asked gently, "What are you drawing?" Micah answered without lifting his hand. "Someone who knows how to listen. They don't need to talk much." Autumn passed without rush. Leaves fell onto the roof like soft blankets, and the morning breeze no longer carried memories of slammed doors or distant sirens. Everything in that house, though simple, breathed. Micah now slept soundly every night. No more nightlights kept on till dawn. No more waking up from noisy wind or strange lights outside. He didn't hug his teddy bear anymore. He simply placed a hand on Sable's back, and that was enough. His sleep was no longer an escape. It had become a destination, a space quiet enough to dream, without fearing he'd wake up somewhere else. Sable lay beneath the window, every night, without command, without leash. He didn't need to be called. He hadn't been trained to guard. Yet he remained awake. Not with wide eyes. Not tensed. Just a silent state, tuned into every breeze, every step outside, every car that passed but did not stop. Micah's bedroom window was left open by a crack. Iris once tried to fix it. "Too cold," she said, but Micah stopped her. "Let the light in, so Sable knows I'm okay." Since then, the window stayed ajar, and Sable stayed there. Iris kept a journal, not to record, but to lay things down, so what couldn't be spoken aloud could exist in ink. In a small drawer beside the kitchen table, next to the salt jar and a sprig of dried rosemary, was a soft-cover notebook, its pages tinged warm brown, each line filled with neat, slanted handwriting. Not decorative, just real. The final page was written on a windless afternoon. No dramatic event, no headline, just an afternoon when the house was quiet. She wrote, "Micah no longer needs me to guard the door every night. The boy has learned how to sleep, not because I taught him, but because someone held the place for me when I was pushed out of the role of being a mother. I used to think, to be acknowledged, I had to win something. But now I know, to hold on to what is right, you just have to not turn away. I didn't turn away from my son, and a dog never turned away from me." The final page contained only 3 lines, no punctuation, no dedication. Sometimes heroes wear no uniform. They do not speak, but when the world turns away, they are the ones who still listen. The only framed photograph in the house hangs by the staircase. No one knows who took it, no polished composition. Light spills unevenly. But in it, a sleeping child, one arm draped down to the floor, and a dog resting its chin on that arm, eyes half closed, while a ray of afternoon sunlight falls across its back. No caption, no title needed. Because when someone truly listens, you don't have to say much. And the door of that house never fully shuts at night, just left ajar, enough for light to come in, enough so a dream doesn't get lost, and enough so that a dog, if he chooses, can rise and step out into the yard